Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. Bread, water and salt crossing the Sahara with a medieval caravan. You begin this journey long before you ever step into the sand. In the medieval world, desert travel was not an adventure undertaken lightly, and it was never improvised. What you ate in the desert was decided weeks or months before departure, often in a cool courtyard or shaded market, where scribes counted sacks and merchants argued quietly over weight and cost. Food, more than weapons or money, determined whether you would survive. If you were joining a caravan crossing the Sahara in the 12th or 13th century, you would not expect variety. You would expect reliability. Desert food was not meant to please you. It was meant to last, to endure heat, motion, dryness, and neglect. It was meant to be eaten slowly, sometimes unwillingly, and often without appetite. The foundation of your diet would be grain, usually wheat or barley, processed into forms that resisted spoilage. Fresh bread was useless here. Instead, you would carry hard bread baked repeatedly until it became dense, dry, and nearly indestructible. In Arabic-speaking regions, this might resemble khubz yabis, bread dried deliberately until it could be stored for weeks. In North Africa, barley cakes were common, cracked rather than sliced, and softened only when soaked in water or milk. You would also carry flour, kept in leather sacks lined with cloth. Flour was lighter than bread and more flexible. Mixed with water, it could become a paste or thin porridge. If fuel was available, usually dry dung or sparse brush, it could be cooked briefly. If not, it could be eaten raw, unpleasant but sustaining. Salt mattered more than you might expect. Not only did it preserve meat, it replaced what the desert took from your body. Salt was eaten directly, added to water, or sucked slowly during the day. In the Sahara, salt was both food and cargo. Entire caravans existed to move slabs of it north and south. You would be eating part of the trade itself. Meat, when you had it, would be dried or salted almost beyond recognition. Beef and mutton were cut into thin strips and left to dry in the sun before the journey even began. In West African regions, this resembled early forms of jerky. Fat was sometimes rendered and carried separately, wrapped in cloth or skin. Fat was precious. It added calories, flavor, and comfort, and it slowed hunger. A small amount could change the feeling of an entire meal. Dates were perhaps the most important food you would eat. They grew at the desert's edge in oases that defined the roots themselves. Dates were sweet, dense, and durable. They could be eaten alone, mashed into bread, or mixed with fat. They required no cooking. They resisted spoilage. They were, in many ways, the desert's gift to travelers. If you were lucky, you would carry legumes, chickpeas, lentils, or fava beans dried and hard. These took longer to cook and required water, so they were used sparingly. When they appeared in a meal, it was often at an oasis or resting place where water was less precious. Water, of course, was the true limit. Everything you ate was chosen based on how much water it required or did not require to consume. Food that made you thirsty was dangerous. Food that could be eaten dry was valued. Meals were planned around water stops, not hunger. You would travel with animals, camels above all. Camels carried food, water, and sometimes became food themselves. Camel milk, when available, was a rare comfort. It spoiled quickly in heat, but when fresh, it provided fat, protein, and hydration. Camel milk was not for long storage. It was for moments, often offered by nomads who knew the land better than you ever would. Meals were not regular. You did not eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You ate when movement stopped, when the animals rested, when water was measured. Sometimes you ate once a day, sometimes less. Hunger became normal, a quiet presence rather than a crisis. You ate sitting on the ground in small groups, sharing from common vessels. Hierarchy mattered. Merchants ate first, guides ate carefully, hired labor ate last. Portions were controlled not by appetite but by calculation. Every mouthful was weighed against the distance to the next well. The desert changed your relationship with food. Taste became secondary. Texture mattered more, whether something could be swallowed easily when your mouth was dry. Smell faded in the heat. Chewing became work. You learned to eat slowly, not for pleasure but to avoid wasting energy. Fast eating led to thirst, discomfort, and regret. Experienced travelers broke bread into small pieces, softened them in the mouth, let saliva do the work water could not. Food was also a social tool. Sharing food built trust. Refusing to share marked danger. Guides and guards were fed deliberately, carefully, to keep them loyal. Disputes over rations could end journeys. You would notice that the desert diet did something else. It narrowed your thoughts. When food is limited, imagination shrinks. You thought less about the future and more about the next stop, the next handful of dates, the next measured sip of water. At night, when the sand cooled and movement stopped, you might dream of food you did not have: fresh bread, cooked meat, fruit that dripped juice. These dreams were common, and travelers wrote about them with embarrassment. Hunger followed you into sleep. Yet this food, boring and repetitive, sustained entire economies. It made trans-Saharan trade possible. Gold, salt, slaves, manuscripts, and ideas moved because people accepted this diet and learned to endure it. You were not meant to enjoy desert food. You were meant to survive it. And as the caravan moved farther from the last settled town, as the grain sacks slowly lightened and the dates grew fewer, you might begin to wonder not whether the food would last, but how long you could remain unchanged by eating this way, day after day, under an unbroken sky. As the days accumulate, you begin to understand that desert eating is not only about what you consume, but when and how. Food is woven into movement itself. You do not stop traveling in order to eat. You eat because, for a moment, travel allows you to stop. A medieval caravan across the Sahara moved slowly, usually at night or in the early morning hours when the heat was tolerable. During these stretches, no one ate. Chewing while riding a camel was uncomfortable and distracting, and the rhythm of travel discouraged breaks. Hunger was postponed, folded into the steady sway of motion. You learned to ignore it. When the caravan halted, often just before dawn or in the late afternoon, food emerged quietly. There was no ceremony. No one announced a meal. You simply noticed people reaching into bags, untying cloth, breaking bread. The first thing you learned was that food was rarely cooked. Cooking required fuel, water, and time, all of which were uncertain. Even when a fire was lit, it was small and carefully guarded. Dry dung, the most common fuel, burned quickly and weakly. Flames were brief, insufficient for elaborate preparation. So you ate food as it was. Hard bread gnawed patiently. Dates chewed slowly until their sweetness became dull rather than sharp. Dried meat softened in the mouth over time, not by heat but by saliva and effort. Meals stretched longer than they should have, not because there was much to eat, but because eating itself took time. Water defined everything. Before eating, you might rinse your mouth if allowed. After eating, you might not drink at all. Drinking after a dry meal increased thirst later, and experienced travelers knew this. They learned to separate eating and drinking, sometimes by hours. Caravan leaders enforced rules about consumption. Water skins were opened at fixed times. Portions were counted. Arguments over food were rare, not because people were content, but because disputes threatened survival. A caravan that fractured over rations did not reach its destination. You also learned that food was not evenly distributed across the journey. Near oases, meals were fuller. You might eat a thin porridge, dates mashed into flour, even a small amount of cooked legumes. These moments felt luxurious. They reminded you what eating could be. Between oases, meals shrank. Sometimes they vanished entirely. You were expected to endure stretches of a day or more with nothing but a few dates or a mouthful of flour. Guides reassured you with distances, not promises. One more night, or after the next rise. Oases themselves were strange places. They were not towns exactly, but clusters of palms, wells, storage huts, and people who lived on the edge of movement. Here, food was both abundant and controlled. You could buy fresh bread, fruit, milk, sometimes meat, but prices were high and quality was uncertain. Fresh food in the desert carried risk. Milk could sour quickly. Meat could spoil. Travelers debated whether it was worth eating at all. Many preferred to stick to their own stores, trusting what they knew rather than what was offered. Still, the temptation was strong. A piece of fresh bread, even coarse and unevenly baked, could feel transformative. People wrote about these meals with more emotion than about cities or markets. Food, briefly, became pleasure again. You noticed, too, how food shaped relationships within the caravan. Those who had more wealthy merchants or officials sometimes supplemented their rations with private stores. This created quiet resentment. Others shared deliberately, building loyalty. A guide given extra dates might walk more carefully, choose better ground, or speak more reassuringly. Hired laborers often fared worst. Their rations were fixed and minimal. They carried loads, tended animals, and received little more than enough to continue. Hunger marked social rank as clearly as clothing. Children, when present, were fed first. This was one of the few rules rarely broken. A child who weakened endangered everyone. Women, especially those traveling with families or as part of merchant households, often managed food distribution, stretching supplies through careful measurement and habit. Illness complicated everything. Diarrhea, common in desert travel, stripped the body of water and nutrients. Those afflicted ate less, not more. Food became something to avoid rather than seek. Travelers described days when they could not swallow even dates without nausea. The body adapted slowly. Hunger dulled, energy shifted. You moved more deliberately, thoughts narrowed. The desert diet did not make you strong, but it made you efficient. Waste of food, of emotion became unthinkable. Religious practice intersected with eating in subtle ways. Muslims adjusted prayer and fasting schedules during travel. Islamic law allowed travelers to break fasts during Ramadan, but not everyone did. Some chose hunger over accommodation, seeing endurance as devotion. Others postponed fasting, prioritizing survival. Jewish travelers similarly adapted dietary laws. Kashrut was observed when possible, but necessity reshaped practice. Dried meat prepared in advance was valued not only for durability but for compliance. When supplies ran low, decisions became personal and quiet. Christian travelers from Europe, less accustomed to desert conditions, struggled most. Their food traditions, cheese, wine, soft bread, did not translate well. Those who survived longest learned quickly from local practices, adopting dates and dried grain with reluctant gratitude. You began to understand that desert food was not static. It changed with geography, culture, and season. In some regions, travelers carried fermented foods, sour milk products, or grain pastes that resisted spoilage. In others, honey appeared thick and heavy, a rare sweetness. Animals were part of the diet in emergencies. Goats or sheep might be slaughtered if supplies failed, but this was a last resort. Fresh meat demanded water to digest and left little that could be stored. Killing an animal also reduced carrying capacity. Every decision had consequences measured in miles. The longer you traveled, the more you noticed silence around meals. People did not talk while eating. Conversation wasted moisture and energy. Eating became inward focused. The desert asked for attention, not commentary. At night, lying on the ground with a full stomach was rare. More often, you lay hungry but calm, accustomed to the feeling. Hunger became background noise like wind. Yet beneath this adaptation, tension remained. Everyone knew that food supplies were finite. A lost camel, a delayed well, an error in distance, any of these could turn routine hunger into crisis. And as the caravan pushed deeper into regions where oases were farther apart and wells less reliable, You might find yourself counting dates not by hunger, but by days, quietly asking how much margin truly remained between careful endurance and collapse. Eventually, every long desert journey reaches a point where food is no longer simply a resource to be managed, but a force that shapes decisions, memory, and meaning. By this stage, you no longer think in terms of meals. You think in terms of survival measured in mouthfuls. The caravan has been traveling for weeks. The food you packed at the beginning, carefully counted, weighed, and argued over, has transformed. Bread has crumbled into powder. Dates have dried further, their sweetness muted. Salt cakes have chipped and cracked. What remains is functional, not comforting. This is when experience matters most. Veteran travelers know that the final stretch of a desert crossing is often the most dangerous, not because it is the longest, but because it tempts carelessness. When the destination feels close, discipline weakens. People eat more freely, drink more often, believing relief is imminent. Caravan leaders work hardest at this stage. They enforce restraint when hope is strongest. They remind everyone that distances in the desert are deceptive, that landmarks lie, that wells fail. Many historical accounts describe this phase not as desperate, but tense, quietly, tightly managed. Food becomes symbolic. A shared handful of dates reassures the group that order still exists. A missed ration signals danger more loudly than any spoken warning. People watch one another eat, not out of greed, but out of calculation. Every consumption is data. If supplies run low, improvisation begins. Flour is mixed thinner. Dates are split smaller. Fat, once added generously, is saved for those who are weakest or most essential: guides, animal handlers, the sick. Equality gives way to prioritization, and with it, discomfort. In extreme cases, animals are slaughtered. This decision is never taken lightly. A camel represents transport, water storage, status, and wealth. To eat one is to shorten the journey's future, but hunger can make tomorrow irrelevant. When meat is eaten in such moments, it is not celebratory. It is rushed, inefficient, and often poorly digested. People speak of sickness afterward, of regret, of bodies overwhelmed by richness after weeks of deprivation. Survival choices carry costs beyond the immediate. Not all food loss comes from hunger. Spoilage is a constant threat. A cracked water skin can ruin flour. Moisture can turn grain moldy. Insects find their way into sacks. Travelers inspect their food daily, smelling, touching, discarding what might cause illness later. Illness, more than hunger, ends journeys. Dysentery, fever, dehydration, these weaken the body until eating no longer helps. Medieval travelers understood this intuitively, even without modern medicine. They feared bad food more than no food. Those who fell behind were rarely abandoned immediately. Caravans slowed, adjusted loads, redistributed rations. But patience had limits. A journey that failed to arrive endangered everyone's livelihood. Decisions were made quietly, sometimes cruelly, always weighed. Reaching an oasis after a long stretch without reliable food was not an explosion of joy. It was subdued relief. People ate cautiously at first, knowing that sudden abundance could harm weakened bodies. Small meals, frequent pauses, water measured even now. Fresh food returned gradually. Bread baked that morning, milk still warm, occasionally meat cooked slowly. Travelers wrote about the strangeness of chewing something soft again, of tasting fat without effort. The final meals of the desert crossing were often the most memorable, not because they were grand, but because they marked transition. The desert diet ended not with celebration, but with quiet adjustment back to normal eating. When the caravan reached its destination, Timbuktu, Sijil Massa, Cairo, or a coastal port, food changed again. Markets offered abundance, spice, choice. Yet many travelers found themselves eating simply, sticking to bread and dates longer than necessary. Habit lingered. The desert left marks on the body and mind. People lost weight, gained tolerance for monotony, developed patience. Some could never return to indulgence without discomfort. Others overate briefly, as if reclaiming lost time. What is striking in medieval accounts is how rarely travelers dramatized this experience. They did not describe heroism. They described routine. Hunger was not a story, it was a condition. Food was not an achievement, it was logistics. And yet, these boring details made history possible. Gold crossed the Sahara because people accepted a diet of grain and salt. Knowledge moved because travelers endured repetitive meals under punishing conditions. Cities rose because caravans arrived intact. The desert diet shaped trade routes, settlement patterns, even religious practice. It favored foods that traveled well, cultures that adapted, people who planned patiently. It rewarded restraint over desire. When you think of medieval travel, it is tempting to imagine adventure, danger, and exoticism. But most days were defined by chewing slowly, swallowing carefully, and counting what remained. The people who crossed deserts were not exceptional because they suffered. They were exceptional because they organized suffering into routine. They made hunger predictable, boredom manageable, and endurance sustainable. Even today, modern survival manuals echo medieval practice: dried food, controlled water intake, slow movement, shared meals. Technology has changed, but the body has not. The desert still demands the same compromises. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of what medieval travelers ate in the desert: not that the food was remarkable, but that ordinary food, eaten with discipline and patience, carried people across places that otherwise could not be crossed. As you imagine the final grains of flour shaken from a bag, the last date eaten not with hunger but with relief, you might wonder how many journeys, historical and modern, still depend not on abundance, but on the careful management of very little. Story 2. Dates and dried meat survival on the Silk Road's southern routes. You do not enter the southern routes of the Silk Road casually. Even before you taste the dust or feel the dry wind against your face, you are already thinking about food: what it will be, how much of it there must be, and how long it needs to last. Unlike the open immensity of the Sahara, these desert corridors stretch in long, broken segments. Plains of gravel, salt flats, rocky foothills, and narrow oases that function like beads on a string. Between them lies emptiness that is no less demanding for being structured. If you are a medieval traveler moving along these southern routes through regions of Persia, Central Asia, and the edges of the Taklamakan Desert, you carry with you generations of accumulated knowledge. Many have gone before you. Many have failed. What they ate and what they could not eat shaped what you now pack. The first thing you learn is that freshness is the enemy. Fresh food ties you to time. The Silk Road requires patience, and patience requires food that waits without complaint. This is why your diet begins with drying, salting, and hardening long before departure. Dates, once again, are central. Carried from the Middle East and Central Asia, they travel well, withstand heat, and offer sugar that the body can access quickly. Dates are not just snacks. They are units of planning. You count them. You assign them to days. You know how many remain without looking. Dried meat accompanies them. This meat, often mutton, goat, or sometimes horse, is prepared carefully. It is sliced thin, salted heavily, and dried in open air until it becomes tough and fibrous. When you eat it, you tear it apart slowly. It resists your teeth. It occupies your mouth longer than its size would suggest, which helps with hunger even when portions are small. Grain appears in many forms. Wheat, barley, millet. Each culture favors what grows nearby. Along the Silk Road, millet is common, especially among Turkic and steppe populations. It is lighter than wheat, easier to cook quickly, and more tolerant of poor storage. Grain is ground coarsely and carried in sacks that are protected from moisture and pests as best as possible. Bread, if present, is dry and dense. Sometimes it is twice baked, sometimes deliberately fermented and then dried. Soft bread does not survive this journey. Hard bread does. You learn to value its predictability over its taste. You may also carry dairy, but not as you know it. Fresh milk spoils within hours. Instead, dairy becomes cheese hardened into near stone, or fermented milk dried into pellets or sheets. These products, known in different regions by different names, can last for months. They are sour, sharp, and slow to dissolve in the mouth. They are not eaten quickly. Fat is precious here too. Animal fat is rendered and stored carefully. A spoonful added to grain transforms both texture and energy. Fat carries calories efficiently, and travelers understand this intuitively, even if they do not calculate it formally. Water remains the central constraint. The Silk Road's southern routes are defined by wells and rivers, but distances between them can still be long and uncertain. Every food item is evaluated by how much water it demands. Foods that increase thirst are avoided. Foods that can be eaten dry are preferred. Before leaving a town or oasis, you eat as fully as you can without excess. You do not gorge. Overeating makes travel uncomfortable and wastes energy. Instead, you aim for balance, a concept that medieval medical theory supports. Physicians warn against extremes, even in hardship. Medical ideas shape food choices. In the medieval Islamic and Persian worlds, food is classified by qualities: hot, cold, moist, dry. Desert travel is considered drying and heating to the body. Therefore, foods that balance these effects, dates, milk products, certain grains, are preferred. This is not superstition. It is a framework that guides survival. You are rarely alone. Caravans form for safety and efficiency. Food planning becomes communal. Some bring more grain, others more meat. Sharing is assumed but not unlimited. Agreements are made before departure, sometimes written, sometimes implied. Pack animals: camels, horses, donkeys carry much of the load, but they also consume food. Grain carried for animals reduces what can be carried for people. This balance is constantly negotiated. In some regions, animals graze along the way. In others, fodder must be carried, adding weight and complexity. The Southern Silk Road is not one road, but many variations. Some routes skirt deserts, others cut through them. Seasonal changes alter availability. A route passable in spring may be deadly in summer. Food planning adjusts accordingly. You hear stories before leaving, stories of travelers who misjudged distances, of wells that dried unexpectedly, of caravans that arrived with only dates left or none at all. These stories are not told for drama. They are instructions disguised as memory. Food also reflects identity. A Chinese traveler may carry different staples than a Persian one. A Buddhist monk eats differently from a merchant. Religious rules shape preparation and choice. Some foods are avoided entirely. Others are eaten with ritual attention. Yet the desert erodes these distinctions. Hunger is a common language. Over time, diets converge toward what works: dates, dried meat, grain, fat. Simplicity enforced by environment. As departure approaches, you check and recheck supplies. Sacks are weighed, containers inspected. You know that once you leave the last settled point, replacement is unlikely. Theft, loss, and spoilage are permanent. The first days of travel feel almost ordinary. Food is still plentiful enough to feel routine. You eat without counting too closely. Hunger is familiar but manageable. The desert has not yet asserted itself fully. But even now, as the caravan moves away from fields and markets, you sense the narrowing ahead. You know that soon, meals will become smaller, choices fewer, and mistakes more costly. And as the road bends toward harsher ground, you may find yourself wondering not whether the food you carry is enough, but how your body and habits will change as the journey reshapes what eating means to you. After the first stretch of travel, the journey settles into what many medieval writers described simply as the road. This long middle phase is neither the anxiety of preparation nor the relief of arrival. It is repetition, and in repetition, food becomes routine rather than event. You wake, you pack, you move. You stop, you eat, you rest. The pattern repeats with only minor variation. The Southern Silk Road does not demand constant crisis. Instead, it demands endurance. The food you eat reflects this. It is steady, predictable, and rarely satisfying. Meals are usually taken once or twice a day, depending on conditions. Morning eating is minimal, sometimes nothing more than a few dates or a small piece of dried bread. Heavier food is reserved for the evening, when movement slows and bodies can digest without immediate exertion. Cooking remains limited. When water and fuel align, a thin porridge might be prepared. Grain is added slowly to boiling water, stirred until thick enough to hold together but thin enough to conserve resources. Fat, if used, is added sparingly. Salt, always measured. Most days, however, there is no cooking at all. Food is eaten cold, dry, or softened only by time in the mouth. You learn how long to hold a piece of hard bread against your tongue before chewing. You learn how to tear dried meat into threads rather than chunks. These techniques are not taught formally. They are learned by observation and necessity. Water discipline governs everything. You are given a ration and you learn to live within it. Some travelers sip constantly, others save water for specific moments. There is no universally correct method, only what works for you, but mistakes are punished quickly. As days pass, your appetite changes. Hunger becomes less sharp, more constant. You do not crave variety, you crave volume which you cannot have. Instead, you eat what is given and move on. The body adapts in subtle ways. Digestion slows. Energy becomes more evenly distributed. You feel fewer spikes of strength or weakness. Medieval medical theory would describe this as the body seeking balance under stress, and in practice, it feels like emotional flattening. Social dynamics around food become more visible. People watch one another's rations, not out of envy necessarily, but out of awareness. If someone eats more, it means someone else will eat less later. Trust is built through restraint. Occasionally, the caravan reaches a small settlement or roadside market. These are not cities but clusters of tents, huts, or stone structures near water. Here, you can buy food usually at high cost. Fresh bread, onions, dried fruit, sometimes eggs. These meals are memorable not because they are luxurious, but because they interrupt monotony. Travelers debate whether to indulge. Fresh food can be dangerous if the body is unaccustomed. Some eat cautiously. Others overeat, driven by desire rather than reason, and pay for it later with discomfort or illness. Illness is the silent companion of the Silk Road. Poor sanitation, shared water sources, and weakened bodies create opportunity for disease. When sickness strikes, food intake changes. Those who are ill eat less, sometimes nothing. Others adjust their rations to compensate, creating tension. Medical knowledge is applied practically. Certain foods are believed to strengthen the stomach or cool the body. Dates are favored for restoring energy. Sour dairy is thought to aid digestion. These beliefs guide choices even when evidence is anecdotal. Religious observance continues but adapts. Fasting rules are bent or postponed. Travelers negotiate between devotion and survival. These decisions are personal and often unspoken. As weeks pass, supplies diminish. You notice the change not by weight but by habit. Dates are counted more carefully. Meat is eaten less often. Grain portions shrink. This is not panic, it is adjustment. The environment reinforces discipline. The landscape offers little distraction. Meals are eaten looking at stone, sand, or sky. Conversation is minimal. Eating becomes inward, functional. Occasionally something goes wrong. A water source is lower than expected. A pack animal is injured. Supplies are redistributed. These moments test planning. Food becomes central again, not routine. In such moments, leadership matters. Those who remain calm and fair preserve cohesion. Those who hoard or panic erode trust. Medieval accounts emphasize this repeatedly. A caravan fails not when food runs out, but when cooperation does. As the journey continues, you begin to lose track of time measured in days. Instead, you think in distances between meals, between wells, between markets. Food becomes the unit of memory. You may forget what you ate last week, but you remember the last time you ate something warm. You remember the last time you felt full. And as the road stretches on, with no clear sign of its end, you may find yourself wondering how long this steady deprivation can continue before it changes not just your body, but your sense of what is normal. Every desert journey ends not with a single moment, but with a gradual return to abundance. Along the Southern Silk Road, arrival is rarely dramatic. There is no sudden transformation from emptiness to excess. Instead, the land softens. Vegetation appears, water becomes less guarded, and food begins slowly to change its meaning. You notice it first in markets. Small stalls appear beside the road, offering flatbread, fruit, and bowls of cooked grain. These are not feasts. They are transitional meals meant to be eaten carefully by bodies that have grown accustomed to restraint. You eat more slowly than you expect. Hunger has been with you for so long that fullness feels unfamiliar. Some travelers report discomfort after even modest meals. Medieval physicians would have warned against sudden excess, and experience confirms their caution. As the caravan reaches a larger town or city, food diversity increases. Spices return, vegetables appear, meat is cooked rather than dried, dairy is fresh. But many travelers find themselves avoiding rich dishes at first. The desert diet lingers in habit and preference. Social rituals around food resume. Meals are eaten seated at tables rather than on the ground. Conversation returns. Yet stories of the journey dominate discussion, and food is central to these stories. Not its flavor, but its absence. People compare rations, distances, moments of scarcity. Hunger becomes a shared narrative, a way to measure endurance. Those who suffered more speak less. Those who suffered less listen carefully. Physically, recovery takes time. Weight is regained slowly. Energy returns unevenly. Some travelers develop lasting digestive sensitivities. Others rebound quickly. Medieval writers note these differences without explanation, attributing them to temperament or divine will. Food also becomes a marker of success. To eat freely is to have arrived. To choose rather than calculate is a sign that danger has passed. Merchants celebrate not with banquets but with normalcy. Yet the memory of hunger persists. Many travelers continue to eat conservatively long after supplies are replenished. They save food instinctively. They dislike waste. Desert habits shape urban life. These habits spread. Travelers bring their preferences back to settled communities. Dried foods gain respect. Simplicity becomes associated with endurance and wisdom. The desert influences cuisine indirectly. Historically, these journeys shape trade networks. Foods that travel well become commodities. Dates, dried meat, hard cheese, these are not just survival foods, they are economic goods. Their value is proven by distance. The Southern Silk Road thrives because people accept this diet. It is not glamorous, it is not varied, but it works. It allows movement across spaces that would otherwise isolate civilizations. When you reflect on the journey, food stands out not as pleasure but as structure. It organized time, movement, and social order. It taught patience and restraint. And perhaps the most lasting effect is psychological. After weeks of measuring every bite, abundance feels fragile. You understand deeply that comfort depends on systems, roads, wells, markets that can fail. Medieval travelers did not romanticize this realization. They recorded it plainly. Food, they understood, is history in its most ordinary form. As you sit in a city far from the desert, eating without counting, you may still remember the feel of dry bread in your mouth and wonder how many modern journeys across time, rather than sand, still depend on the same quiet discipline. Story 3. Camel milk and endurance nomads who fed the travelers. You often think of medieval travel as a struggle against geography alone. Endless sand, scorching sun, and scarcity of water. But the truth is more nuanced. Travelers were only half the story. The other half was the people who lived in these extreme environments, the nomads who knew the desert as intimately as a city dweller knows streets. Their knowledge of food, water, and survival dictated whether a caravan could endure and what it ate along the way. Camel herders in particular held a unique place in desert travel. Camels were more than pack animals. They were living larders, water tanks, and engines of endurance. But camels could not survive on thin air. They required grazing, water, and management, which meant that nomads had to be expert strategists, balancing the needs of their herds with the needs of passing travelers. Camel milk was the most significant contribution a nomad could make. Unlike meat, milk is renewable. A camel can provide liters of milk daily if it is healthy and fed. For medieval travelers, camel milk was rare and precious. It was nutrient-rich, containing fat, protein, and water, everything the body needed when standard rations had dwindled. The milk itself was not uniform. It could be drunk fresh, which required immediate consumption, or fermented, creating a lightly sour, thicker drink that could last for days. Some nomads dried milk into thin sheets or small lumps, producing a product that was easy to carry and preserve. This milk could be rehydrated with water, eaten as is, or added to grain for a simple, sustaining porridge. Nomads also managed food for themselves and travelers through trade and hospitality. Dates, dried meat, and grains were standard items. A well-planned oasis or temporary encampment often contained caches of food intended for passing caravans. Travelers rarely understood the sophistication behind these stores. They simply accepted that food appeared at critical moments and sometimes disappeared just as mysteriously. Preparation and storage were meticulous. Meat was salted and dried in the sun. Milk was fermented or transformed into portable forms. Grain was protected from sand, insects, and moisture. Every step mattered because failure could mean death. Nomads knew that travelers depended on these stores, but they also knew that their own survival came first. The balance between generosity and necessity shaped every decision. Camels themselves were central not just as food producers but as carriers. They transported the travelers, rations, and water, often in quantities calculated to last exactly between known wells. Nomads judged the weight each animal could bear, factoring in the animal's own need for sustenance. Overloading a camel could result in injury, slowed progress, or death for the herd, any of which could imperil a caravan entirely. Water management was equally critical. Nomads memorized the locations of wells, springs, and temporary pools. They guided caravans along routes where water could be reliably found, often in exchange for fees or trade goods. Without such guidance, travelers relied on maps, oral instructions, or memory, which were prone to error. The desert does not forgive mistakes in water planning. Meals under nomadic guidance were carefully measured. Travelers were rarely allowed to eat freely. Portions of bread, dates, and dried meat were calculated to conserve supplies until the next reliable source. Camel milk could supplement these rations, but it was given judiciously. Excess milk could strain the herd, leaving everyone, including the nomads, vulnerable later. Social structure influenced access to food. Tribal hierarchies determined who ate first, who received camel milk, and who could trade for additional dates or grain. Travelers often found themselves negotiating with these rules, learning respect for customs that might seem strange in a settled city. Hunger could force compromises, but ignoring hierarchy could be dangerous. Nomads also monitored the health of travelers in indirect ways. They observed fatigue, pallor, and dehydration, subtly adjusting rations or travel speed. They recognized early signs of illness and often advised rest or extra water. Their interventions were pragmatic, not sentimental. Survival, not comfort, was the goal. Interestingly, nomadic influence also extended to cooking techniques. Travelers might learn to mix dried milk with grain, or to soak dates in water before eating. These small adjustments, seemingly minor, had profound effects on digestion, hydration, and energy. Over time, such knowledge became absorbed into the routines of caravans, forming a subtle, unspoken curriculum for desert endurance. Even religious and cultural practices intersected with food management. Certain tribes adhered strictly to dietary rules, influencing what they would trade, share, or prepare. Travelers learned to navigate these rules carefully, respecting both the nomads' needs and their own survival. Camel milk, for instance, might be offered only after certain rituals or at specific times, underscoring its value beyond nutrition. Yet for all their skill, nomads were not invincible. Drought, disease in herds, theft, or sudden sandstorms could disrupt supply chains. When this happened, travelers felt the impact directly. Rations were reduced, travel slowed. Decisions about which animals to slaughter or which portions to conserve became matters of life and death. Through all of this, travelers developed respect and reliance on nomads. Survival was rarely due to personal skill alone. It depended on networks of knowledge, experience, and careful preparation. Camel milk, dried meat, dates, and grain were more than sustenance. They were currency, trust, and history carried along invisible lines of desert memory. As you imagine sitting in a small desert camp, drinking sour camel milk, breaking hard bread, and gnawing at dried meat, you may realize that survival depends not merely on your own endurance, but on understanding systems far older and more complex than yourself. And yet, even in this carefully managed environment, questions linger. How do nomads decide when to prioritize their herd over the travelers? How much of survival depends on the wisdom of those who have always lived at the edge, and how much depends on chance? The answers are rarely recorded, leaving you to wonder about the countless unspoken negotiations that allowed life and travel to continue in the desert. Once the caravan sets out under the guidance of nomads, the daily rhythm of food, movement, and survival becomes precise, almost mechanical. Every aspect of desert travel is intertwined with sustenance, and you quickly notice that the nomads treat food not as pleasure but as a measure of control and patience. Morning begins early. Travelers wake before the sun fully rises, not for beauty but for practicality. The desert heat comes quickly, and exertion in the hottest hours is dangerous. The first meal is often minimal: a handful of dates, a sip of camel milk, perhaps a small piece of dried bread. The purpose is not fullness, it is energy conservation. Eating too much at the start could dehydrate you before the sun rises, a mistake that could turn a routine day into crisis. Water rationing dominates the first hours of travel. Nomads administer water carefully, monitoring both travelers and animals. Camels receive measured quantities, enough to maintain stamina, but never so much that the herds swell and strain. Travelers follow suit, mimicking this discipline with the few skinfuls allocated to them. You realize that the desert diet is not about calories alone, it is about managing a slow and steady state of survival. Meals on the road are rarely cooked. The exception comes when small fires are allowed at temporary encampments or night halts. Then, grain might be soaked briefly in water, camel milk added to form a thick porridge, or small portions of meat heated. These meals are slow, deliberate, and shared with attention to hierarchy. Elders, guides, and key merchants receive priority, while laborers or less important travelers eat afterward. Nomads maintain strict routines around portioning. A sack of dates may be divided into daily allotments for travelers, herders, and animals. Meat is rationed, with each slice calculated for endurance rather than appetite. You watch them measure carefully, counting with experience rather than numbers, ensuring that no one consumes more than their share. This discipline is the difference between reaching the next oasis or facing hunger before it arrives. As days pass, the traveler's understanding of food changes. Initial cravings for variety fade. You stop yearning for fresh vegetables or rich sauces because the desert imposes monotony. The repetition of dates, dried meat, hard bread, and camel milk becomes both predictable and comforting. You learn to savor small differences: the slightly sweeter dates, the thicker milk, the grain that has softened just enough in the sun. Subtlety replaces abundance. Animal management is a constant preoccupation. Camels are more than carriers, they are lifelines. Nomads monitor their feeding and rest carefully. Overworked animals lead to slower travel and diminished rations. At each stop, the herders assess water and forage availability, making decisions about pace, load distribution, and what supplies must be conserved. Travelers watch quietly, aware that the fate of the journey depends on choices they may not fully control. Unexpected events test the balance. Sandstorms can force unplanned halts, depleting rations faster than expected. Wells may be low or contaminated. Animals may falter or fall ill. When these crises occur, nomads adjust, reallocating food and water, sometimes sacrificing portions for the herd's survival. Travelers feel the consequences immediately: smaller rations, extended marches, and increased fatigue. Social dynamics emerge quietly but powerfully. Travelers learn to gauge when to accept what is offered, when to ask for more, and when to withhold. Observing nomads, distribution methods teaches subtle lessons about fairness, hierarchy, and trust. Even the smallest gesture, handing over an extra handful of dates, can reinforce loyalty or signal favoritism. You become acutely aware that food is not merely nutrition, it is communication. The desert also teaches improvisation. Travelers may mix camel milk with flour to create a makeshift porridge when water is scarce. Dates may be crushed into grain to extend their sweetness. Occasionally, wild herbs or limited foraged greens are added, though these are rare and often used with caution to avoid digestive upset. Every innovation is carefully considered, balancing nutrition, hydration, and survival. Evenings are slow and deliberate. After the day's march, the caravan halts. Camels are tended, wounds inspected, water replenished if possible. Travelers eat a slightly larger portion, more dates, a small piece of meat, a sip of milk, and then rest. Conversation is sparse. Food is not a source of entertainment, it is a pause in the ongoing negotiation with the desert. Over time, you notice physiological changes. Hunger becomes background noise, no longer urgent. Your body adapts to small, regular rations. Energy stabilizes. Sleep deepens, punctuated by the quiet sounds of camels and the desert night. Travelers begin to accept monotony as the natural rhythm of survival. Yet tension persists. Nomads, though skilled, cannot control every factor. Weather, terrain, and chance continue to shape outcomes. Travelers learn to watch for subtle signs: the fatigue of animals, the color of water, the condition of supplies. Each observation informs the next decision. Food becomes an index not only of hunger but of safety, distance, and progress. By the end of this middle phase, you understand the desert diet as more than sustenance. It is instruction, discipline, and connection. The food, measured and monotonous, teaches you about limits, endurance, and the quiet strategies that sustain life in extreme environments. And as the weeks pass under the guidance of nomads, you may begin to wonder: how much of survival depends on the traveler's skill, and how much depends on the wisdom embedded in generations of nomadic knowledge? How different would the journey be if the caravan relied only on maps and numbers, without the subtle judgment that camel milk, dates, and measured rations represent? After weeks under the desert sun, guided by nomads and sustained by camel milk, dried meat, and dates, the journey begins to approach its end. Arrival is rarely heralded by fanfare. It is quieter, almost imperceptible. The landscape shifts subtly. Sand gives way to gravel, then to fertile valleys, streams appear, and greenery becomes more consistent. With these changes comes a transformation in food, not sudden, not luxurious, but gradual and undeniable. The first noticeable difference is in the availability of fresh water. No longer rationed carefully from skins and wells, travelers can drink with less restriction. Camel milk, still present, becomes supplementary rather than essential. People rediscover thirst differently, appreciating abundance after months of strict limitation. Meals expand incrementally. Hard bread is replaced by softer forms. Dried meat is supplemented by fresh meat or fish if available. Grain porridge, once thin and functional, can be prepared more generously with fat or honey. Small markets offer vegetables, fresh fruits, and eggs. The novelty is not richness but choice, the ability to decide what to eat and when. Yet the desert diet leaves an imprint. Travelers often eat conservatively at first, mindful of sudden excess. Even when food is plentiful, they avoid overeating, still accustomed to measuring portions and packing consumption. Habits formed under scarcity persist, a reminder that survival once required restraint and patience. Social dynamics around food also shift. Hierarchies loosen, though some residual caution remains. Those who shared rations fairly during the journey are respected. Those who hoarded or mismanaged supplies may feel subtle suspicion. Trust built around food in the desert carries into settled communities, influencing interactions far beyond the journey itself. The lessons of camel milk and nomadic guidance extend beyond the immediate needs of survival. Travelers absorb knowledge of sustainable consumption, animal care, and route planning. They learn that success depends not solely on their personal endurance, but on systems of care, observation, and experience maintained over generations. The nomad's expertise, embedded in daily routines, is a form of living knowledge, transmitted silently through practice rather than written word. Historical evidence reflects this influence. Trade networks thrive because travelers know how to manage limited resources. Camel milk, dried meat, and grain become standard commodities along established routes. Settlements at oases flourish because they anticipate travelers' needs. Nomadic practices shape commerce, survival strategies, and even cultural exchange. The desert diet is not merely personal, it is structural. Illnesses that might have been fatal are mitigated by careful rationing and attention to hydration. Travelers understand that food is medicine as much as sustenance. Dates restore energy. Fermented milk aids digestion. Fat supplements calories. Salt prevents dehydration. Knowledge of these effects spreads across cultures through repeated interaction, trade, and observation. Memories of scarcity endure. Travelers often recount these experiences in later years, emphasizing the monotony, discipline, and quiet resilience required. Diaries, letters, and oral accounts rarely celebrate flavor. They highlight endurance, calculation, and the subtle management of resources. The desert teaches patience, humility, and awareness of limits, lessons easily forgotten in times of abundance but vital during travel. As travelers reintegrate into cities and settled towns, the contrast between scarcity and plenty sharpens. Markets overflow with food, yet their choices are now filtered through months of rationing. Travelers appreciate each meal differently, understanding the unseen labor and planning that made it possible. They carry with them a respect for systems social, logistical, and ecological that maintain survival in extreme environments. Even after the journey ends, the influence of nomads, camel milk, and desert rations lingers. Food becomes more than nourishment. It is a measure of trust, a reflection of knowledge, and a reminder of human resilience. Travelers may never forget the texture of hardened bread, the tang of fermented milk, or the quiet ritual of rationing under the sun. These sensory memories link directly to survival and history. Ultimately, the desert diet of the Silk Road shapes not only the body but the mind. It teaches travelers to measure, to prioritize, to endure. It reminds them that comfort is fragile, that reliance on others, especially those who know the land intimately, is essential, and that survival is rarely about heroism, but about meticulous attention to the ordinary. And as you reflect on the long days under sun and wind, sipping camel milk, gnawing dried meat, and counting dates, you may ask yourself, how many modern journeys across deserts of climate, politics, or uncertainty still depend on patience, discipline, and the quiet wisdom of those who have traveled before. Story 4. Pilgrims to Mecca: Food and Faith on Desert Roads. The pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, was a journey unlike any other medieval traveler undertook. Unlike merchants or envoys, pilgrims were bound not by commerce or diplomacy, but by faith. Yet even faith could not protect against the realities of desert travel. Preparation, especially for food and water, was critical. The success of the journey depended on more than devotion. It depended on endurance, planning, and knowledge of how to eat, conserve, and survive in harsh terrain. Months before departure, pilgrims would assemble supplies. Grain, usually wheat or barley, was essential. In many communities, women and men would grind the grain into coarse flour, baking it into hard, dense loaves capable of withstanding weeks in a sack. Fresh bread was impractical. It spoiled within a day under desert heat. Dried bread, called khubz yabis in Arabic, became the mainstay of the diet. Some pilgrims would carry flour instead, which could be mixed with water at resting points to make a simple porridge. Dates were prized above all. They were compact, calorie-dense, and rich in sugar, providing quick energy for long days under the sun. Caravans often rationed dates carefully, allocating a set number per traveler per day. Pilgrims learned early that a date eaten at the wrong moment could provoke thirst, while a date saved for the right hour could stave off exhaustion. Salt was another indispensable element. Beyond taste, it prevented dehydration and replaced electrolytes lost to sweat. Travelers carried salt in small cloth sacks, sometimes licking pieces sparingly, other times mixing it with water for a mineral-rich drink. Salt also preserved meat, ensuring that dried provisions could survive the journey without spoiling. Dried meat was less common than dates or grain, but still highly valued. Mutton, goat, or occasionally camel meat would be cut into thin strips, heavily salted and dried in the sun. The result was tough, fibrous, and dense, difficult to chew, but sustaining. For pilgrims, this meat represented both nourishment and a tangible connection to the preparation process. Each strip was counted and rationed, each bite carefully measured to last between water points. Camel milk was sometimes available, depending on the caravan's route and the generosity of nomadic guides. Unlike merchants, pilgrims were less likely to have private herds. Milk was therefore a rare supplement, often shared collectively, consumed cautiously to avoid waste. In fermented form, it could last longer, offering sustenance without immediate spoilage. Water remained the ultimate limiting factor. Pilgrims planned meals around wells, oasis settlements, and natural springs. Eating without access to water was dangerous. Foods that required hydration, such as dry porridge or grain, were eaten sparingly unless water was nearby. Even the act of chewing dates demanded strategic timing, as sugar increased thirst. Preparation extended beyond the practical. Religious practices influenced food choice and timing. Certain rituals required fasting, while others permitted strategic indulgence. Pilgrims would often adjust their meals to coincide with prayer schedules, observing sacred timings while also maintaining physical stamina. Eating became both spiritual and survival practice. Packing was meticulous. Grain and bread were sealed in cloth sacks, dates stored in small bundles, meat carried in leather pouches. Weight had to be balanced with the load capacity of camels or donkeys. Excessive weight could slow travel, stress animals, and increase the risk of ration depletion. Every ounce mattered. Travelers sometimes carried small additions: dried legumes, preserved vegetables, or even honey. These were not luxuries but supplements, providing variety and necessary nutrients. Their inclusion required careful calculation. Each item added weight, used water in preparation, and altered rationing plans. Pilgrims learned to value simplicity above indulgence. The social dimension of food was significant. Pilgrims traveled in groups, often joining caravans for safety. Sharing meals was a communal experience. Portions were distributed according to need, social status, and role in the journey. Experienced pilgrims knew how to read these distributions, observing quietly and adjusting their consumption to maintain harmony. Stories of past pilgrimages informed planning. Travelers recounted routes, dangers, and moments of scarcity. They spoke of wells that dried unexpectedly, storms that destroyed provisions, and the precise timing of eating relative to prayer and rest. These tales were practical guides disguised as moral or spiritual instruction. When departure finally came, pilgrims carried not only provisions but accumulated wisdom. Each item in the pack, grain, dates, meat, milk, salt, was a tool for endurance. The desert, unyielding and indifferent, would test both faith and preparation. And though the pilgrims' minds were focused on spiritual goals, their bodies were trained to navigate monotony, ration carefully, and survive on the most ordinary but reliable foods. By the first day on the road, pilgrims begin to discover how preparation and reality diverge. Bread is harder than expected, dates are smaller than imagined, and water points are fewer or farther than anticipated. Each step reinforces the lesson. Survival depends on more than desire. It depends on discipline, observation, and respect for the limitations imposed by the desert. And as you follow these pilgrims in your mind, you may wonder, how do faith and survival intersect when hunger, exhaustion, and thirst are constant companions? How do ordinary provisions, bread, dates, and dried meat, become instruments not only of survival, but of spiritual endurance, shaping the body and mind along the way? Once the caravan sets out on the desert route toward Mecca, the rhythm of travel quickly becomes intertwined with food, water, and ritual. Unlike merchants, who move with flexible goals, pilgrims have a destination dictated by faith. Yet the desert does not care about devotion. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion impose strict limits on what the body can endure, and even the most devout pilgrim must accommodate these realities. The day begins early before the sun fully rises. Travelers eat sparingly at dawn. A few dates, a small slice of hard bread, perhaps a sip of water. Eating too much at this hour could bring discomfort, dehydration, or indigestion under the desert heat. Nomadic guides often oversee these first meals, ensuring that everyone consumes just enough to maintain stamina without risking the day's march. Travel along the southern routes of Arabia requires careful attention to timing. The hottest hours are reserved for rest, sometimes in the sparse shade of acacia trees or behind low dunes. During these periods, the stomach empties and the body adapts to minimal intake. Even seasoned travelers describe the sensation of slow hunger creeping in like an inevitable companion, quiet, persistent, unavoidable. Meals are generally simple and repetitive. Hard bread baked weeks before departure is torn into small pieces. Dates are counted and eaten in measured intervals. Salt, essential for replacing electrolytes lost to sweat, is consumed cautiously, often mixed with water. Dried meat is reserved for later in the day or for particularly strenuous stretches. Camel milk, when available, is distributed sparingly, its use carefully calculated to support both travelers and animals. Despite monotony, the act of eating takes on social and spiritual significance. Pilgrims often pause to pray before meals, offering thanks and focusing on the ritual as a mental anchor against the hardships of travel. Food becomes intertwined with devotion. It sustains the body while reinforcing discipline and patience, echoing the greater spiritual purpose of the journey. Water governs the desert diet more than any other element. Travelers pace their consumption carefully, knowing that wells may be unpredictable or overused by previous caravans. Every meal is planned in relation to water availability. If water is scarce, porridge may be skipped, dates and dried meat eaten sparingly. Experienced pilgrims develop an intimate sense of distance and timing, calculating exactly how much to consume at each stage. The desert, of course, is unpredictable. Sandstorms can obscure landmarks and exhaust travelers. Wells can dry unexpectedly. Nomads, when part of the caravan, act as both guides and ration managers, adjusting portions or slowing progress to ensure survival. Travelers quickly learn that hunger is not simply discomfort. It is a signal, a guide, a reminder to observe and follow the rules of the environment rather than personal desire. Illness adds further complexity. Diarrhea, sunstroke, or fatigue can affect anyone. Those afflicted eat less, drink cautiously, and rely on companions for support. The communal nature of pilgrimages ensures that no one is entirely alone, yet hierarchy still governs food distribution. Leaders and experienced travelers are prioritized, while the vulnerable children, elderly, sick receive careful attention, reflecting both pragmatism and moral responsibility. The monotony of meals is punctuated occasionally by small luxuries, a rare fresh goat's milk, a handful of honey, or fresh fruit at an oasis. These moments, though brief, are remembered vividly. Chroniclers often describe these meals with disproportionate detail, emphasizing their restorative power and psychological impact. For pilgrims, these small indulgences are evidence of endurance rewarded not by wealth, but by survival. Religious practice also interacts with the desert diet. Fasting during the journey is permissible to some extent, but many pilgrims adjust their observances for survival. Decisions about when to eat and when to fast are negotiated quietly, balancing faith with practicality. Food becomes both physical sustenance and moral choice. Each mouthful carries weight, each ration a lesson in patience. By the second week of travel, the rhythm of desert eating is ingrained. Hunger becomes a constant, steady companion rather than a source of panic. Travelers measure rations without conscious thought, chew slowly, and drink with care. The body adapts, energy stabilizes, and the mind becomes attuned to subtle changes in terrain, weather, and animal behavior. Every meal, though simple, is an act of calculation, endurance, and shared experience. Caravans gradually approach their final stretches. Food becomes symbolic as much as functional. Dates, bread, and camel milk are no longer merely survival items. They represent progress, endurance, and connection to those who have traveled this route for centuries. Pilgrims reflect on what they have consumed and endured, often noting the monotony and sacrifice as part of their spiritual journey. Yet, even in the rhythm of routine, the desert preserves uncertainty. Will the next water source hold enough? Will camels falter under the heat? Will illness or exhaustion disrupt careful plans? These questions underscore the intimate connection between survival and faith. Pilgrims must act within the limits of both physical reality and spiritual devotion, making each bite, each sip, and each step an exercise in awareness and endurance. As you imagine the pilgrims walking mile after mile, counting dates, chewing dry bread, sharing camel milk, and observing the slow rhythm of survival, you may find yourself pondering, how does faith shape resilience in extreme conditions? How do rituals, discipline, and ordinary food intersect to sustain not only the body but also the spirit through hardship? After weeks of walking, rationing, and observing the careful measures of desert travel, pilgrims finally reach the outskirts of Mecca. Arrival is seldom marked by dramatic celebration. Instead, it is quiet, a gradual acknowledgement that the journey's physical trials have ended. The desert diet, the hard bread, dates, dried meat, and sporadic camel milk remains vivid in memory, shaping how pilgrims experience abundance once they reach their destination. The first noticeable change is water. Wells and fountains of the city flow freely, and travelers drink without the meticulous calculation that governed their desert rations. Every sip feels restorative, almost miraculous after weeks of measured intake. Camel milk, once essential, becomes a rare supplement rather than necessity. Pilgrims who tasted its fermented tang daily now drink freely, but with care, their bodies still adapting from months of conservation. Food diversity gradually returns. Soft bread replaces hard, brittle loaves. Cooked meat, vegetables, and fresh fruits appear in markets and homes. Grain porridge, now prepared with fresh ingredients, becomes rich and palatable. Even honey, once a rare luxury, is available in generous quantities. Yet pilgrims often eat cautiously at first. Their stomachs, accustomed to minimal portions and monotony, require time to adjust to abundance. Overindulgence can cause illness. a reminder that the body retains lessons learned in the desert. The desert diet's discipline also carries a psychological impact. Travelers reflect on the monotony of their rations and the careful packing required to survive. Each date eaten along the road was not simply nutrition, it was a controlled act of endurance. Each sip of camel milk represented both sustenance and reliance on the wisdom of nomads and caravan leaders. Even now, the memory of rationed meals shapes behavior. Food is no longer merely taste or hunger, it is a lesson in patience, planning, and trust. Social rituals around food resume fully. Meals are shared in communal spaces, accompanied by conversation and celebration. Pilgrims recount experiences, emphasizing moments of scarcity, ingenuity, and endurance. They discuss how the monotony of bread and dates taught discipline and humility. These stories serve not only as entertainment but as instruction for future pilgrims. Each detail of desert food management, the number of dates per day, the way bread was broken, the timing of camel milk consumption becomes part of a collective memory. Religious significance intertwines with these experiences. Food, in the desert, was a conduit for faith. Eating became prayerful, measured, and intentional. Upon reaching Mecca, pilgrims often reflect that the endurance required to ration and survive mirrors the spiritual discipline at the heart of the pilgrimage itself. The physical trials of the journey reinforce spiritual lessons: patience, humility, and reliance on both God and human knowledge. Beyond spiritual and personal lessons, the desert diet influenced culture and commerce. Foods that traveled well, dates, dried meat, preserved grains remained staples along pilgrimage routes. Markets and caravanserais anticipated needs based on centuries of recorded and observed experience. Travelers learned not only to survive, but to contribute to a system that sustained hundreds, sometimes thousands, of pilgrims annually. The practical knowledge of rationing, meal timing, and preservation was as much part of the pilgrimage's enduring infrastructure as the roads and wells themselves. Memory of scarcity also leaves lasting personal impact. Even after returning home, pilgrims often eat conservatively, mindful of waste and grateful for abundance. They continue to value simple, nourishing foods over luxury, carrying forward habits honed under desert conditions. In some cases, recipes or preservation techniques learned on the journey: fermented milk, dried bread, portable grain mixtures spread to settled communities, subtly shaping local diets long after the pilgrimage concludes. Finally, reflection often centers on human resilience. Travelers acknowledge that survival was rarely about heroism. It was about disciplined attention to ordinary, often monotonous details. Eating small portions at precise intervals, conserving water, observing the needs of animals, and following the guidance of experienced nomads or caravan leaders, these were the acts that sustained life across vast, inhospitable landscapes. Every mundane meal, every measured sip, contributed to the larger achievement of reaching Mecca. As the pilgrimage ends, you can imagine pilgrims sitting in a shaded courtyard, breaking bread with dates and sipping water, contemplating the miles behind them. They reflect on how their ordinary food, bread, dates, dried meat, and milk, taught endurance, discipline, and interdependence. The desert, though harsh, revealed that survival is a combination of preparation, observation, and careful execution. Even faith, powerful as it was, relied on the mundane realities of eating, drinking, and packing oneself. And as you consider the journeys of countless pilgrims across centuries, you may ask yourself, how much of spiritual accomplishment depends on the mastery of ordinary tasks? How often do we overlook that discipline, endurance, and attention to detail manifested here in the careful management of bread and dates shape both survival and meaning in ways we rarely notice? Story 5. The Spice Traders provisions how food sustained long ocean voyages. Long before the age of refrigeration, spice traders crossed oceans with nothing more than careful planning, salted meat, and durable provisions. The Indian Ocean, the South China Sea and later the Atlantic were unforgiving highways. Storms could appear without warning. Winds could stall or push ships far off course. And yet, for centuries, merchants transported cinnamon, cloves, pepper, and nutmeg across vast stretches of water. None of this would have been possible without the food that sustained both sailors and their ships. Preparation began long before leaving port. Merchants and ship captains calculated exactly how many days the voyage might take, factoring in potential delays due to storms, calm seas, or navigational errors. Food, in this context, was not nourishment alone, it was survival insurance. Grain, legumes, dried fruits, and hardtack were selected for their durability and ability to withstand both humidity and insect infestations. Hardtack, or ship's biscuit, was the backbone of these provisions. Baked twice, often until nearly lifeless in texture, it could endure months in a ship's hold. It was dense, flavorless, and highly durable. Sailors developed techniques for eating it, soaking it in water, milk, or even beer to soften it, or breaking it into tiny pieces for slow consumption. To the modern palate, it might seem almost inedible. To a medieval or early modern sailor, it was indispensable. Salted meat was another critical component. Pork, beef, or fish were heavily salted and packed in barrels. Salt preserved the protein against spoilage, though even salted meat had limits. Careful rotation of stock, inspections for spoilage, and distribution of portions ensured that supplies lasted as long as possible. Spoiled meat could make entire crews sick, and knowledge of storage and handling was vital. Dried legumes and grains supplemented the diet. Lentils, chickpeas, rice, and barley provided sustenance when meat ran low. These staples were simple to store, resistant to pests when kept dry, and could be cooked slowly over shipboard fires. Spices, ironically, were sometimes added not just for flavor but to mask the monotony and occasional odor of preserved provisions. Cinnamon, pepper, and clove made meals more palatable, even when the base ingredients had long since lost appeal. Water was the most limiting resource. Ships carried large casks, but evaporation, leakage, and contamination posed constant threats. Freshwater sources were rare along extended oceanic routes. Sailors learned to ration carefully, sometimes drinking only when necessary, sometimes diluting their supply to extend its life. Food and water had to be balanced precisely. Grains and legumes required boiling, which used water, while salted meat needed washing or soaking. Every meal was a calculation. Shipboard hierarchy affected food distribution. Captains and merchants often ate first, followed by officers and key navigators. Ordinary sailors received rations according to rank and availability, ensuring the crew's survival without threatening leadership authority. Discipline around food was strict. Overconsumption or waste could imperil everyone on board. Preparation extended to preventing spoilage. Ships were packed carefully to keep food dry. Barrels of grain and salted meat were elevated off the damp deck. Spices were stored in airtight containers when possible. Sailors developed rituals, daily inspections, rotating supplies, checking for leaks, and even listening to the subtle sounds of shifting barrels. Each action was ordinary in isolation, but cumulatively essential for survival. The first days at sea often felt manageable. The wind fills the sails, the horizon is open, and provisions seem abundant. Sailors eat freely, though carefully, and drink when water is available. Salted meat is sliced thin, hardtack soaked in liquid to soften it, legumes simmered if possible. The monotony of these meals begins almost immediately, but early discipline reinforces the habits needed for longer stretches. Yet unpredictability is always present. Storms may force rations to be consumed faster than planned. Ships may be delayed for weeks without reaching friendly ports. Provisions must stretch longer than originally intended. Experienced captains and merchants know that survival depends not on abundance but on careful management. Sailors quickly internalize the lesson. Every meal matters, every sip counts, every piece of salted meat or biscuit is precious. Spices, often the object of the voyage itself, are sometimes used strategically for survival. A pinch of pepper or clove might make a dull meal feel edible. Cinnamon could add warmth to boiled grain. Though the quantities are small, their psychological effect is significant. These details are recorded in ship logs and letters, not for their culinary delight, but for their impact on morale. By the end of the first month, sailors develop a rhythm. Meals are planned with precision. Hardtack is broken into pieces in the morning, dates saved for afternoon energy, salted meat rationed for evening. Water is measured against distance, wind, and forecasted storms. Sailors' bodies adjust to monotony, hunger becomes background noise, and energy is conserved through routine rather than indulgence. As the voyage progresses, challenges compound. Spoilage, dehydration, fatigue, and illness all threaten progress. Ships may be becalmed for weeks, food stores dwindling. Crews innovate, soaking hardtack in seawater before boiling it to stretch grains, mixing small amounts of meat into porridge, or sharing rations strategically to maintain morale. Every act of eating becomes a matter of calculation, endurance, and survival. And yet, despite hardship, there is continuity. These voyages, repeated over centuries, maintained a steady exchange of spices, goods, and culture across oceans. Survival depended not on extraordinary heroism but on ordinary measures: salted meat, hardtack, legumes, and careful rationing. It was through these simple provisions that trade, exploration, and cultural contact were possible, allowing civilizations separated by thousands of miles to connect. As you picture sailors slicing hardened meat under the open sky, soaking inedible biscuits in brackish water, and counting casks of fresh water, you may begin to wonder how much of the age of global trade rested not on ships or compass, but on the unglamorous, painstaking management of ordinary food. How many voyages succeeded or failed because of the meticulous attention given to bread, salt, and water. As the spice traders' ships moved farther from the coast, the voyage settled into a rhythm defined largely by monotony, rationing, and survival. The initial excitement of setting sail fades quickly, replaced by the steady calculation of food, water, and morale. In these long stretches at sea, the diet is simple, repetitive, and unchanging, and yet, it is this very simplicity that enables survival. Mornings begin before dawn. Sailors awaken in cramped quarters, often damp and salty from the night's condensation, and reach for the nearest provisions. Hardtack is soaked in whatever liquid is available: freshwater if the cask allows, sometimes brackish water if supplies are tight. Salted meat is cut sparingly, boiled if possible, or chewed slowly to make it last. Legumes or grains are cooked in small portions, using minimal fuel and water. Breakfast is functional, not enjoyable. It sustains movement, but pleasure is secondary. Throughout the day, meals are regimented. Each sailor receives a fixed ration, measured carefully by officers. Overconsumption is forbidden, as it risks both shortage and fatigue. Bread must last. Meat cannot spoil. Water must be conserved. Each bite becomes part of a larger calculation. How many days remain until the next port? How far has the ship drifted from planned provisions? And how well are the sailors enduring the monotony? Monotony itself becomes a psychological factor. Hardtack, boiled until soft, tastes almost identical every day. Salted meat becomes predictable in texture and flavor. Water, rare and rationed, is more a measure of survival than enjoyment. Sailors cope by ritualizing meals, measuring out portions carefully, distributing evenly, and sharing small observations about the quality of the bread or the condition of the casks. These rituals create structure in an otherwise unpredictable environment. Spoilage is a constant threat. Even salted meat can sour if barrels are damaged or stored improperly. Mold can infest hardtack or legumes. Crew members inspect every container daily, listening for the subtle shifts of moisture, shaking barrels to detect liquid leaks, or observing the color and smell of provisions. Detecting early signs of spoilage can prevent illness or ration loss, but mistakes are sometimes unavoidable, reminding travelers that survival is fragile. Water management dictates every meal. Boiling grain or meat consumes significant quantities. Sailors must balance hydration with sustenance. Drinking too early or too freely risks depletion, Drinking too little risks faintness, cramps, or heat stroke. The strategy requires constant vigilance. Even during calm, when the sun is hidden, rationing is adhered to strictly. Water is a metric of time, progress, and discipline. The monotony is broken only occasionally. Freshly caught fish, if nets or lines succeed, may be boiled with grains or dried for later meals. Sometimes a rare fruit or vegetable is traded at port stops, providing temporary relief from uniformity. Such moments are remembered vividly. A single orange or handful of coconut becomes a highlight in weeks of repetition. Chroniclers often exaggerate these instances, but the psychological relief they provide was real. The middle phase of the voyage is also a test of social dynamics. Crew morale is intimately tied to food. Officers monitor portions carefully, ensuring fairness. Sailors quickly learn to accept the hierarchy, understanding that overstepping or hoarding could jeopardize the entire journey. Sharing is expected but limited. Cooperation is essential. Hunger becomes both a shared burden and a mechanism for social cohesion. Physical adaptation occurs gradually. Sailors' appetites diminish, not from illness but from repetition and rationing. Bodies adjust to a minimal caloric intake, energy stabilizes, and the sense of hunger becomes background noise. Psychological resilience develops. Monotony is accepted, and energy is allocated for essential tasks rather than indulgence. Survival depends on routine and adaptation, not vigor. Illness occasionally strikes. Seasickness, scurvy, and minor infections become common, especially if provisions lack vitamin-rich foods. Spices are sometimes employed medicinally: pepper, cloves, or cinnamon, added to porridge to aid digestion, improve taste, or bolster morale. Though modest, these interventions demonstrate the sailor's ingenuity and practical knowledge of food beyond mere sustenance. Storms and calms disrupt routines. During tempestuous weather, cooking may be impossible, and rations are often reduced to prevent spoilage. During prolonged calms, water consumption must be reduced further to extend survival. Sailors improvise. Hardtack may be eaten dry, small amounts of salted meat rationed in even smaller slices, and water shared sparingly. The physical and mental discipline learned in the early days becomes essential. Despite monotony and hardship, the middle passage is also where experience is accumulated. Sailors learn timing, rationing strategies, and methods for maintaining morale. The journey's success hinges on attention to detail, measuring out hardtack, boiling grains without wasting water, and observing the condition of salted meat. Every small act contributes to survival, often in ways that are invisible to those outside the ship. And so, as the spice-laden vessels continue across endless horizons, sailors chew their hardtack, sip precious water, and taste the occasional salted meat. You may begin to realize that these unremarkable meals, repetitive, bland, and monotonous, were the backbone of global trade. Without this quiet discipline and careful planning, spices would never have crossed oceans, cultures would not have intertwined, and history itself would have followed a different course. After weeks or even months at sea, spice traders finally approach land. The horizon shifts from endless blue to faint outlines of islands, coasts, or harbor cities. Relief is felt not only in the eyes but in the stomachs of sailors, who have subsisted on hardtack, salted meat, legumes, and the occasional small ration of fresh or preserved food. Arrival does not erase the lessons of monotony, it illuminates them. Survival at sea relied as much on discipline and routine as on wind and navigation. The first change is immediate: water. Fresh water is abundant at port and sailors drink with little measurement. The careful rationing, so critical for weeks, suddenly becomes optional. Camel-like thirst transforms into a pleasure, each gulp both quenching and celebratory. Yet even now caution lingers. Sailors' bodies, accustomed to measured intake, react slowly to excess. Drinking too freely can cause discomfort, highlighting the lasting imprint of the ocean diet. Meals expand gradually. Fresh bread replaces hardtack, meat is now cooked rather than salted, and fruits and vegetables, rare or non-existent at sea, become available. Grain porridges are richer, spiced, and combined with fats or sweeteners. These meals are not merely more enjoyable, they represent a subtle shift in physical and psychological state. Sailors learn that abundance, while comforting, must still be navigated carefully. Habits formed at sea persist, shaping portions and pace of eating. The social dimension of food also shifts on land. At sea, hierarchy governed who ate first and who rationed last. In port, social rituals are restored but reconfigured. Merchants and captains share meals with local partners, negotiating not only spices but also hospitality, trust, and alliances. Food becomes a medium of cultural exchange as well as sustenance. Sailors who endured the monotony of the ocean bring both knowledge and humility to these interactions. The psychological imprint of the sea diet is profound. Sailors reflect on weeks of bland, repetitive meals, rationed carefully to sustain both body and morale. Hardtack, salted meat, and limited water are remembered not as punishment, but as essential tools that allowed the trade to succeed. Chroniclers and journals often dwell on these ordinary provisions, recording their importance with the same precision applied to maps, winds, or cargo lists. Spices themselves, the ultimate goal of the voyage, are contextualized by the diet. Cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, traded for goods and wealth, were once only seasoning rare relief during weeks of monotony. Their presence at the end of a voyage represents not just commerce but a reward for endurance. They are testimony that careful management of mundane food made distant riches possible. Without the discipline of hardtack and salted meat, the spice trade would have faltered. Health and recovery are gradual. Scurvy, digestive distress, or fatigue can persist even after landfall. Sailors must readjust to richer diets. The body's rhythm, trained to conserve energy and tolerate monotony, requires careful reintegration into abundance. Some portions of the crew adopt extreme caution, others overindulge and pay the price with illness. These experiences underscore a persistent truth. Survival and recovery are both measures of discipline. Cultural and technological legacy emerges from these voyages. Shipboard diets, methods of preservation, and rationing strategies influence later exploration, colonization, and global trade. Hardtack evolves into modern biscuits. Salted meats inform long-distance preservation techniques. Lessons learned in oceanic monotony shape logistics, provisioning, and even naval strategy for centuries. Without these practical adaptations, the world's interconnected trade networks would have developed differently. Morale and social cohesion, tied intimately to food at sea, carry enduring lessons. Sailors who shared limited rations learned to cooperate, negotiate, and trust. Those who violated discipline caused tension and sometimes disaster. The unremarkable meals of bread, salted meat, and legumes were thus instruments not only of physical survival, but of social stability. Survival depended as much on the management of human behavior around food as on the food itself. Finally, reflection underscores the subtle genius of endurance. The spice trade's success depended less on daring navigation or daring merchants than on the careful, persistent management of the mundane. Ordinary provisions, bland, repetitive, and often monotonous, enabled extraordinary achievements. Every bite of hardtack, every sip of rationed water, every preserved piece of meat was a quiet act of history-making. The spices that delighted courts and markets across the world were made possible by months of boring, disciplined survival at sea. As you imagine sailors sitting on the deck at landfall, slicing softened hardtack, sipping fresh water, and observing the bustling harbor around them, you may realize global trade, cultural exchange, and the reach of civilizations depended not on heroism alone, but on the unglamorous mastery of ordinary food. And perhaps in the quiet endurance of these sailors, you glimpse the hidden foundation of much of history itself, built incrementally on bread, salted meat, and careful rationing. Story 6. Medieval Pilgrims, Portable Provisions: How Bread and Cheese Traveled Hundreds of Miles. In medieval Europe, pilgrimage was a central experience of spiritual life. Unlike the long ocean voyages of spice traders, pilgrims traveled overland, often for hundreds of miles, to sacred sites such as Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome. Despite the spiritual purpose, survival required meticulous planning, especially food. Ordinary travelers could stop at inns or markets, but pilgrims often moved through remote countryside, forests, and hills where reliable food sources were scarce. Their survival depended on portable, long-lasting provisions: bread, cheese, dried meat, and occasionally preserved fruits. Preparation for a pilgrimage began weeks, sometimes months in advance. Families and local communities contributed supplies, ensuring that the pilgrim would not be forced to beg for food along the way. Grain was baked into hard loaves, dense and dry, designed to resist mold and spoilage. This bread, often referred to as ship's bread or stale bread in contemporary writings, could last weeks when stored carefully. It was almost inedible when fresh, but its durability was invaluable. Pilgrims learned to slice it thinly, sometimes soaking it in water or broth to soften it before consumption. Cheese was equally important. Hard cheeses, often aged for months, provided protein and fat without risk of rapid spoilage. Pilgrims carried small wedges, wrapped in cloth or wax paper, sometimes smoked to preserve them further. Cheese supplemented bread, adding essential nutrients and variety to a monotonous diet. It also served as a form of currency. Excess could be traded at inns, monasteries, or markets in exchange for water, grain, or other necessities. Dried meat, while less common than bread or cheese, was still a critical provision for longer journeys. Beef, pork, or game meat was salted, sometimes smoked and packed in small pouches. Like cheese, it was nutrient-dense and durable. Pilgrims rationed it carefully, eating sparingly at first and saving some for particularly long or arduous stages. The taste was often tough and bland, but its caloric content was unmatched by any other portable food of the period. Legumes and grains were occasionally included, though their preparation required access to water and fire, making them less convenient than bread or cheese. Lentils, chickpeas, and barley could be boiled into simple porridges, providing warmth and sustenance at the end of a long day. Pilgrims who traveled in groups often shared cooking duties, pooling water and firewood to prepare communal meals when circumstances allowed. Salt played a vital role. Beyond flavor, it preserved meat and cheese, ensuring that supplies remained edible throughout the journey. Pilgrims carried small amounts in pouches, using it sparingly for both preservation and consumption. Salt was a measure of foresight. Misjudging how much was required could mean spoiled rations and a risk of hunger. Storage was another critical consideration. Supplies were packed in leather satchels, wooden boxes, or small sacks. Pilgrims had to balance durability with weight. Too much weight would slow travel, increase fatigue, and risk injury. Too little could leave them without sufficient provisions. Experienced pilgrims learned to ration by eye, estimating how long supplies would last across each stage of the journey. Water management dictated how certain foods were used. Hard bread and dried meat required hydration to be edible, while cheese could be eaten with minimal water. Travelers had to plan each meal according to available water sources, which were often inconsistent. Wells, streams, and monasteries provided hydration points, but access could be limited by distance or terrain. Community and social networks were essential. Pilgrims traveling alone were at a disadvantage, as shared knowledge and pooled resources improved survival. Groups would often divide supplies based on stage length, difficulty of terrain, and anticipated availability of food. Those who misjudged provisions could rely on group members, but doing so required trust and social diplomacy. The act of eating during a pilgrimage was both pragmatic and ritualized. Meals were typically eaten in silence or with minimal conversation, reflecting spiritual discipline. Pilgrims might pause to pray before consuming bread or cheese, acknowledging that sustenance itself was part of the journey's spiritual framework. Hunger, while physically taxing, became a companion to devotion, a reminder of reliance on both divine providence and careful preparation. By the time pilgrims departed for distant shrines, they had developed intimate familiarity with their provisions. They understood how to slice bread for longevity, portion cheese for endurance, and ration dried meat for maximum effect. Each item was not simply food, but a tool for survival, a lesson in discipline, and a measure of self-control. Yet even with careful preparation, uncertainty remained. Roads could be impassable due to weather, water could fail, or inns might be inaccessible. Every day required calculation: how much bread to eat, when to consume cheese, and how to maintain energy for walking long distances. Survival depended not on abundance but on foresight, knowledge, and restraint. As you imagine a pilgrim setting off from a village, backpack weighted with hard loaves and wedges of cheese, you can see that survival hinged on the most ordinary and seemingly boring details. The journey demanded discipline, attention, and endurance. And even as the road stretched ahead, you may wonder, how did pilgrims maintain both their physical stamina and spiritual focus when the monotony of bread, cheese, and dried meat became the rhythm of every day? Once pilgrims left their villages, the monotony of travel quickly set in. Each day consisted of walking long distances over hills, through forests, and across rivers, with food rationing as a constant preoccupation. The diet was simple: hard bread, small wedges of aged cheese, and occasional dried meat. Yet within this simplicity lay the key to survival. Every morsel was calculated, and every sip of water measured against both distance and anticipated sources. Mornings were deliberate. Pilgrims often awoke before dawn to begin walking while the air was cool. Breakfast was minimal: a few slices of bread, a small piece of cheese, perhaps a date if available. The goal was not satisfaction but energy conservation. Eating too heavily early could cause fatigue or thirst, particularly when streams and wells were hours away. Discipline was necessary from the very first step. The rhythm of rationing became second nature. Bread was sliced thinly, broken into pieces to last throughout the morning. Cheese was divided meticulously, ensuring that protein and fat were spread across multiple meals. Dried meat was often reserved for the afternoon or evening, when the body required higher energy for the day's final stages of walking. Pilgrims quickly internalized these patterns. The monotony was not only physical but psychological, teaching patience and self-control. Water remained central to every decision. Pilgrims planned meals around wells, streams, or monasteries that provided reliable hydration. Bread and dried meat required soaking or chewing with water to prevent dehydration. Cheese, while more forgiving, still demanded liquid to avoid dry mouths and fatigue. Travelers learned to ration water as carefully as food, calculating each sip against miles traveled and the next known water source. Travel in groups enhanced survival. Experienced pilgrims shared knowledge about which foods to eat first, how to prepare them for better digestion, and when to conserve portions. Those who mismanaged their rations relied on the generosity of others or suffered fatigue and hunger. Social dynamics were subtle but constant. Cooperation ensured endurance, while disputes over food could endanger the group. Along the route, pilgrims encountered inns, monasteries, or hospitable villagers who sometimes offered food. These moments were rare but impactful. A simple meal of fresh bread, cheese, or pottage could revitalize exhausted travelers. Pilgrims learned to appreciate such offerings without relying on them, understanding that these were bonuses rather than guarantees. The unpredictability reinforced the necessity of meticulous rationing. Meal preparation, while simple, required attention. Bread could be softened in water or broth to make it easier to chew and digest. Cheese might be sliced or grated to distribute more evenly. Dried meat could be boiled briefly or chewed slowly. Even minor adjustments made a significant difference in energy maintenance over long days. Such practices were often passed down orally, from veteran pilgrims to novices, forming a subtle tradition of survival knowledge. Psychological endurance was as important as physical stamina. Monotony of diet and terrain could sap morale. Pilgrims coped by creating small rituals around meals, pausing to pray, sharing stories, or carefully arranging portions. Hard bread and cheese, though bland, became familiar companions, their routine providing structure in an otherwise uncertain environment. Over time, hunger became a background state, regulated by discipline and expectation rather than panic. Unexpected challenges tested preparation. Rain could soak bread, making it inedible. Heat could spoil cheese or dried meat. Streams might dry up or be contaminated. Each disruption forced adaptation, soaking bread in broth, rationing water more strictly, or eating smaller portions of meat. Pilgrims quickly learned that flexibility, combined with prior preparation, was essential for survival. Evenings were marked by rest and reflection. Pilgrims typically ate their remaining portions, ensuring that each day ended with enough energy for the next morning. Fires, when allowed, were used sparingly to cook legumes or soften bread. Conversations were quiet, often reflecting on both physical experiences and spiritual contemplation. Meals became both nourishment and meditation, reinforcing the journey's dual purpose, sustaining body and soul. By the second or third week of travel, pilgrims had internalized a rhythm of survival. Bread, cheese, and dried meat were no longer just food, they were instruments of discipline, endurance, and reflection. Each bite represented careful planning, observation of terrain, and awareness of group dynamics. Survival was rarely dramatic. It was the result of sustained attention to ordinary routines, executed consistently over time. And yet, even in this disciplined routine, questions linger. How do pilgrims balance spiritual devotion with the physical demands of travel? How much does resilience depend on preparation versus adaptability to unforeseen challenges? In the quiet crunch of bread and tang of cheese, you may glimpse the delicate interplay of body, mind, and faith that defines every pilgrimage. After weeks of walking, pilgrims finally approach their destination, perhaps the cathedral at Santiago de Compostela, the shrine at Canterbury, or the tombs of Rome. Arrival is rarely a moment of dramatic triumph. It is more often a quiet, reflective relief. The monotonous diet of hard bread, cheese, and dried meat has shaped the body, disciplined the mind, and prepared the traveler for the challenges of spiritual devotion. The first noticeable change is abundance. Water flows freely, markets provide fresh bread, cheeses vary in flavor and texture, and cooked meals become accessible. Pilgrims who have subsisted on months of simple, dry provisions eat carefully at first. Their bodies, accustomed to rationing, react slowly to richer foods. Overindulgence can cause discomfort, reminding travelers that survival left a lasting imprint. Even now, every bite carries the memory of restraint and adaptation. Meals at the destination are infused with social and spiritual significance. Pilgrims break bread together, share cheese and cured meats, and recount the trials of the journey. Each story emphasizes the monotony endured, the discipline required, and the ingenuity applied to rationed meals. Local clergy or hosts may provide pottage, fresh bread, or wine, rare luxuries along the road. Pilgrims remember these offerings vividly, contrasting them with the simplicity of provisions carried from home. The diet of the road leaves more than physical impact. It shapes perspective, gratitude, and mindfulness. Travelers recognize the value of every morsel, understanding that ordinary food, though dull, was critical to survival and success. Bread and cheese are no longer merely nutrition. They are symbols of foresight, patience, and human ingenuity. Every slice consumed along the journey was a practical and moral exercise, teaching moderation, discipline, and interdependence. Pilgrims' accounts reveal this interplay of survival and reflection. Chronicles, letters, and oral traditions emphasize not flavor or indulgence, but endurance and care. A loaf of bread that lasted for a week, a wedge of cheese rationed carefully across long days, becomes legendary in retelling. These boring details are in fact central to understanding medieval pilgrimage. Survival depended on preparation, restraint, and adherence to routine. The experience also affects long-term habits. Pilgrims returning home often eat more thoughtfully, conserve supplies, and maintain routines developed during travel. Knowledge of bread making, cheese preservation, and rationing spreads, influencing local culinary practices. Communities benefit from techniques honed on the road: longer-lasting bread, better storage for cheese, and methods to transport provisions safely across distances. Ordinary food becomes a vehicle for cultural and technological continuity. Spiritual lessons intertwine with practical ones. Just as the pilgrim endures hunger, fatigue, and monotony, so too does the faithful endure trials of life. Bread and cheese are both sustenance and metaphor, representing patience, discipline, and reliance on preparation and providence. Pilgrims reflect on the connection between the body and spirit, recognizing that care for the physical self enables devotion and contemplation. Social dynamics also leave a lasting impression. Shared rations, group decision-making, and cooperation during scarcity foster trust and communal bonds. Those who hoarded or mismanaged provisions often found themselves isolated or punished, while generosity reinforced social cohesion. Lessons learned around bread and cheese echo beyond the journey, shaping interpersonal behavior and community values. Arrival at the destination marks both an ending and a beginning. Pilgrims may attend Mass, venerate relics, or participate in ceremonies, but the memory of the journey of measured bites of bread, the tang of preserved cheese, and the endurance of monotony remains vivid. Ordinary provisions, carefully prepared and rationed, enabled the extraordinary spiritual and social achievement of completing the pilgrimage. Finally, reflection underscores the quiet genius of ordinary food. Survival, faith, and endurance rested not on lavish meals or heroic interventions, but on mundane, repeatable actions: slicing bread, rationing cheese, boiling dried legumes, and measuring water. These small acts, repeated daily across miles, shaped not only individual pilgrims but also the broader culture of pilgrimage in medieval Europe. As you picture weary travelers resting before a cathedral, breaking bread and sharing cheese, you may realize the spiritual triumph of pilgrimage was inseparable from the practical mastery of ordinary food. In the unremarkable routines of rationing and preparation, medieval pilgrims achieved endurance, reflection, and community lessons as relevant today as they were centuries ago. Story 7. Desert Soldiers rations how armies survived long campaigns in the Sahara. The Sahara, vast and unforgiving, stretches endlessly under the sun, a shifting landscape of sand dunes, rocky plateaus, and occasional oases. For medieval armies, campaigns across this desert demanded far more than tactical skill or weaponry. Survival hinged on provisions, what soldiers carried in their packs, on their beasts, and in mobile supply caravans. Ordinary rations, dried meat, grains, dates, and water determined not just endurance, but the outcome of entire campaigns. Preparation for a desert campaign began long before soldiers set foot on the sand. Commanders calculated the length of the route, anticipated heat, and estimated caloric needs for each soldier and pack animal. Grain, usually wheat or millet, was ground into coarse flour and baked into hard loaves. These loaves, dense and long-lasting, formed the backbone of the army diet. They could be carried in leather satchels or woven baskets, sometimes buried in sand during marches to stay cool, and rationed carefully to last days or weeks. Salted and dried meat, typically mutton, goat, or camel, was another staple. Heavily salted and sometimes smoked, it could withstand the desert heat, though it required careful storage to prevent spoilage. Soldiers learned to slice meat thinly, chew it slowly, and conserve portions for critical moments during the march. Fat content was crucial, providing concentrated calories for the long hours under the sun. Dates, abundant in oases, were prized not only for energy but also for portability. Each soldier carried small bundles, counting rations carefully. Dates could be eaten quickly for an energy boost or reserved for times when water was scarce, providing both sugar and fiber. They were lightweight, non-perishable, and versatile, making them the ideal desert companion. Water was the limiting factor. Armies could carry only so much, and wells were sparse across the Sahara. Commanders had to plan meticulously, balancing marches with anticipated water sources. Soldiers consumed water sparingly, often drinking only at designated intervals. Even small errors in rationing could be fatal. Camel corps were essential, not just for carrying soldiers but for transporting additional water and provisions. Grain porridge was sometimes prepared when water was available. While labor-intensive, it provided warmth and calories, supplementing bread and dried meat. Legumes such as lentils or chickpeas were occasionally added, though these were less common because they required more cooking time and water than the army could spare during fast marches. The diet's monotony was extreme, but survival demanded consistency. Soldiers often ate at the same intervals each day, measuring rations carefully. Overconsumption early in the day could leave a soldier weak by nightfall. Too little and fatigue would slow the march. Experienced troops understood that endurance depended on rhythm, patience, and careful attention to food, not merely courage or training. Supply logistics were critical. Desert campaigns relied on mobile depots and camel convoys. Commanders organized caravans to distribute provisions, ensuring that each unit received the correct share of bread, meat, dates, and water. Mismanagement could result in dehydration, starvation, and collapse of morale, regardless of the army's size or weaponry. Even the most disciplined units could fail if rations were inadequate or misallocated. Soldiers also adapted to the desert environment through experience. Hard bread could be soaked in water to make it edible. Dried meat might be softened with camel milk. Dates were portioned for maximum endurance. Soldiers learned to eat while walking, sometimes gnawing at rations while keeping pace in formation. Every bite was strategic, every sip of water carefully considered. Fatigue and hunger were constant companions. Sunstroke, dehydration, and heat exhaustion were daily threats. Armies moved at a pace that balanced progress with survival, resting only during the hottest hours or when water was accessible. Meals were functional, consumed quickly, and often shared communally. Soldiers who hoarded or mismanaged rations risked both personal collapse and group jeopardy. Even minor miscalculations could have cascading effects. A shortage of water in one unit could slow an entire army. Spoiled meat could cause illness and weaken morale. Commanders relied on careful observation, ensuring that rations were distributed fairly, stored properly, and consumed at optimal times. Knowledge of the desert, combined with meticulous attention to food and water, was as critical as any battlefield maneuver. The physical environment reinforced discipline. Endless sand dunes, blistering heat, and sparse vegetation demanded restraint and careful packing. Soldiers quickly learned that survival depended not on heroism alone, but on the mundane management of ordinary provisions: bread, meat, dates, and water. These were the true instruments of desert warfare. As the army marches deeper into the Sahara, the monotony of rations, the rhythm of consumption, and the calculation of hydration define every step. Victory and survival are inseparable from these ordinary practices. And yet, as you imagine soldiers gnawing dried meat, breaking hardened loaves, and counting each sip of water under a relentless sun, you may wonder, how did armies maintain cohesion, morale, and endurance when every day was defined by scarcity and monotony? As armies pressed further into the Sahara, survival became an exercise in careful calculation and monotonous endurance. The landscape was unrelenting. Shifting dunes, rocky outcrops, and the oppressive heat demanded that soldiers maintain a strict routine for eating, drinking, and resting. Here, ordinary provisions, bread, dried meat, dates, and water were far more significant than swords or strategy. The daily rhythm was dictated by both climate and rationing. Marching usually began before dawn, when temperatures were cooler and shadows longer. Breakfast was minimal: a small wedge of hardened bread, a few dates, and sometimes a slice of dried meat. Eating too much risked dehydration or fatigue during the hottest part of the day, so discipline was paramount. Soldiers were trained to consume only what was necessary to maintain energy and focus. Water management dominated every decision. Camels transported both soldiers and additional supplies, but wells and oasis stops were infrequent. Drinking was rationed carefully, and even bread and meat consumption had to consider available hydration. Hard bread required water to be edible. Dried meat and dates were consumed strategically, often in combination with minimal water to prevent exhaustion. Every bite and sip was an exercise in survival strategy. The monotony of rations demanded psychological resilience. Soldiers ate the same food daily, sometimes for weeks. Hard bread was nearly flavorless, dried meat tough and fibrous, dates sweet but limited in number. Yet this repetition became a stabilizing rhythm. Troops learned to focus less on taste and more on function. Each portion provided calories, each sip preserved strength, each ration sustained the march. This endurance shaped both body and mind, teaching patience, self-control, and the importance of routine. Supply lines were fragile and required constant monitoring. Camel caravans, often hundreds strong, carried barrels of water, sacks of bread, and bundles of dried meat. Commanders supervised the distribution, rationing portions according to distance remaining, terrain difficulty, and health of soldiers. Mismanagement could devastate morale, cause dehydration, or even force retreats. Every small decision, from the number of bread slices allocated to a squad to the timing of water breaks, carried consequences that could ripple across the army. Meals were functional and quick. Soldiers often ate while marching, tearing bread into small pieces, chewing slowly and swallowing dried meat in measured bites. Water breaks were brief and strategically timed, usually at the edge of an oasis or near a known well. Cooking was rare, firewood was scarce, and preparing legumes or porridge required precious water. The desert diet left no room for indulgence. Every action was deliberate, calculated to sustain energy and life. Morale was intimately tied to rations. A well-fed soldier could march longer, think more clearly, and endure the sun's heat. Scarcity, on the other hand, caused tension and conflict. Hoarding food or water could create divisions, while equitable distribution reinforced cohesion. Experienced commanders understood that managing the army's food was as critical as any battle plan. The success of the campaign depended on the mundane discipline of feeding men and animals consistently, even in monotony. The soldiers' relationship with food evolved over time. Bread became more than sustenance. It was a constant companion, its weight and texture familiar and reliable. Dates were treasured, rationed carefully to provide energy at precise intervals. Dried meat, though tough, became a prized source of protein, providing long-lasting strength. Soldiers developed an intimate understanding of their provisions, treating them with both practicality and respect. Illness and exhaustion heightened the stakes. Heat stroke, diarrhea, or dehydration could strike suddenly. Soldiers who mismanaged rations or drank too little water were at risk. The army relied on collective knowledge. Veteran soldiers guided novices in rationing, timing meals, and conserving energy. Each individual's survival reinforced the group's endurance, creating a delicate web of interdependence sustained by ordinary food. The desert tested not only physical endurance but also mental fortitude. Marching across endless dunes under the sun, soldiers relied on the predictability of their rations to structure their day. Hunger became an accepted companion, fatigue a constant measure of discipline, and monotony a tool for psychological stability. Small routines, breaking bread at dawn, chewing dried meat mid-march, counting dates, provided structure in an environment that was otherwise unpredictable and punishing. By the end of the second week, soldiers had internalized a rhythm that balanced hunger, fatigue, and morale. Ordinary provisions were no longer just food. They were instruments of survival and cohesion. The success of the campaign depended less on bold maneuvers and more on the patient, disciplined consumption of bread, meat, dates, and water. Even minor miscalculations could have severe consequences, emphasizing that victory was as much about careful logistics as battlefield strategy. As you picture soldiers marching mile after mile across the Sahara, gnawing dried meat, breaking hard bread, and counting their last handful of dates while monitoring the camels and the scarce water supply, you may wonder, how much of history, victory, or defeat in desert campaigns depended not on sword or strategy, but on the meticulous management of ordinary food and water. After weeks of marching under the relentless sun, soldiers finally approach an oasis, a walled city, or a strategically vital position. Relief is palpable, yet it is measured and deliberate. Unlike the immediate satisfaction of victory, the Sahara teaches that survival is cumulative, the result of small, consistent acts: rationing bread, chewing tough dried meat, and packing consumption of precious water. The end of a march does not erase the lessons learned on the road, it illuminates them. The first change upon arrival is water. Fresh water is suddenly abundant at wells, cisterns, or riverbanks, and soldiers drink more freely than they dared during the march. Yet even this abundance is approached with caution. Soldiers' bodies, adapted to rationed intake, respond slowly. Overconsumption can lead to discomfort or even illness, a reminder that endurance is built gradually and that survival habits persist beyond immediate danger. Food, too, shifts from necessity to comfort. Fresh bread replaces hard loaves, local meats and vegetables are available, and the monotony of dried rations ends. Pilots of the army or camp cooks often prepare simple stews or porridges, using the last preserved grains and legumes, supplemented with fresh ingredients. Soldiers savor these meals, but even in abundance, their habits of careful consumption endure. Rationing, learned in hardship, leaves an imprint that persists long after scarcity has ended. The discipline of the desert diet shapes both morale and reflection. Soldiers often recount the march. The monotony of bread and dried meat, the meticulous calculation of water, and the small routines that structured each day. Veterans advise newer soldiers on rationing strategies, telling stories of how careful planning prevented collapse or enabled progress during heat waves and sandstorms. These boring lessons in survival become part of military knowledge, passed down across campaigns and generations. The relationship between ordinary food and military success becomes clear. Bread, dates, and dried meat were not just sustenance, they were instruments of endurance, cohesion, and operational reliability. Units that mismanaged rations risked exhaustion, desertion, or collapse. Units that succeeded did so by combining careful provisioning with discipline, training, and observation of the harsh environment. In other words, victory was inseparable from the meticulous management of mundane resources. Supply logistics leave an enduring mark on strategy. Camel caravans and mobile depots, carefully timed and routed, determined the feasible range of desert campaigns. Leaders who understood these constraints could maneuver effectively. Those who ignored them risked disaster. The practical knowledge of rationing how many loaves per soldier, how much meat to divide per camel, and how to pace water consumption was as essential as knowledge of terrain or enemy positions. The psychological imprint of rations is profound. Months of monotony create discipline and mental endurance. Soldiers learn to ignore hunger pangs, tolerate fatigue, and focus on small, repeatable tasks. The act of chewing hard bread or chewing dried meat becomes a meditation of survival, each bite measured, each sip deliberate, each ration a contribution to collective endurance. These lessons shape behavior long after the campaign ends, influencing personal habits, military culture, and even leadership decisions. Recovery at the destination is gradual. Soldiers' bodies require time to adjust to fresh food, cooler shelter, and unrestricted water. Their muscles, conditioned to long marches and rationed caloric intake, must adapt to rest and abundance. Illness, dehydration, or scurvy may linger, reinforcing that survival is not instantaneous but cumulative. Even in victory, reflection on rationing and endurance remains central. The broader lesson is clear. Success in the Sahara depended as much on ordinary food and careful planning as on combat skill or weaponry. Bread, dates, dried meat, and water, the unremarkable, monotonous staples of the desert, enabled armies to survive and operate in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Without careful attention to these details, campaigns would fail before armies even engaged in battle. As the soldiers rest in the shade, rehydrating, slicing fresh bread, and boiling water for a simple meal, one can see the profound connection between endurance, provision, and history. Ordinary, repeated, and meticulously managed food shaped the rhythm of survival, the cohesion of units, and ultimately the outcomes of desert campaigns. And as you imagine the long columns of soldiers stretching across sand dunes, counting each piece of bread, measuring each sip of water, and sharing dates among comrades, you may reflect. How much of human history, conquest, survival, and empire depended not on valor alone, but on the quiet, relentless mastery of ordinary, boring food. Story 8. Monks and their meals. How Cistercian provisions sustained contemplation and labor. In the heart of medieval Europe, Cistercian monasteries emerged as centers of labor, learning, and spiritual devotion. Unlike the nomads of the desert or ocean-going spice traders, monks lived in enclosed communities, yet survival and productivity depended on the careful management of food. Their diet was simple, austere, and highly structured, designed to sustain long hours of prayer, contemplation, and manual labor. Bread, legumes, vegetables, and occasionally fish or cheese were the staples that maintained both body and mind, providing energy for a life measured by the rhythm of the day. Cistercian monks embraced a philosophy of simplicity. Meals were intentionally plain, avoiding indulgence or elaborate preparation. Bread was the cornerstone of sustenance course, dense loaves baked daily from wheat or rye, often unseasoned. This bread was consumed in carefully measured portions at set times, reflecting both practical necessity and spiritual discipline. Monks believed that moderation in food reinforced spiritual focus. Gluttony distracted from prayer and labor, while monotony reinforced mindfulness. Vegetables were cultivated in monastery gardens and carefully preserved. Cabbage, beans, onions, and leeks formed the primary plant-based components of the diet. Seasonal changes dictated availability, and monks learned to ration, ferment, or store vegetables to last through winter months. Beans and lentils provided protein, crucial for sustaining energy during long periods of manual work. Even the act of harvesting, drying, and cooking vegetables became a spiritual exercise in patience and observation. Cheese and dairy were sometimes included, but sparingly. Hard cheeses were preferred for their durability, easily stored and consumed without spoilage. Fresh milk or soft cheese was rare, often reserved for infirmaries or special occasions. These provisions supplemented the basic diet, offering concentrated calories without disrupting the disciplined simplicity central to monastic life. Occasionally, fish appeared on the monks' tables, particularly during fasts or holy observances when meat was forbidden. Monasteries near rivers, lakes, or coasts developed systems for catching, drying, and storing fish. Preservation techniques were vital. Salted or smoked fish could last for weeks, ensuring that monks adhered to dietary restrictions while maintaining nourishment. Fish also carried symbolic weight. Abstaining from meat and consuming fish reinforced spiritual humility and obedience. Water and ale were the primary liquids consumed. Monks drank water for hydration and ale for its caloric content, as weak beer provided both nutrition and a safe alternative to potentially contaminated water. Drinking was regulated, often synchronized with meals, prayer, or labor schedules. Excessive consumption was discouraged, reflecting a broader ethos of moderation and mindfulness. Monastic meals followed strict timing. The day was structured around the canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Meals were limited to designated times, typically 2 main meals midday and evening, and sometimes a smaller portion in the morning. Each meal was silent or accompanied by readings, reinforcing reflection and contemplation. Eating became a meditative act, linking sustenance to spiritual awareness. Portioning was precise. Bread, legumes, and vegetables were distributed carefully to ensure that monks had enough to sustain energy for labor and prayer, but not enough to encourage indulgence. Overconsumption was seen as spiritually detrimental, while underconsumption threatened physical endurance. The diet was thus a delicate balance between health, discipline, and devotion. Labor was integral to the monastic routine, and the diet was calibrated to support it. Monks spent hours in fields, gardens, or workshops, performing physically demanding tasks. Bread and legumes provided slow-burning energy. Vegetables offered hydration and vitamins. Small amounts of cheese or fish supplied concentrated protein. Meals were functional, designed to sustain activity without distracting from spiritual obligations. Preparation and preservation were communal. Baking bread, tending gardens, fermenting vegetables, and smoking fish were tasks shared among monks. Skills were passed from elder members to novices, ensuring continuity of knowledge and consistency in quality. This labor, while practical, also served spiritual purposes. Discipline, cooperation, and attention to detail were cultivated alongside physical sustenance. Even in austerity, variety emerged subtly through seasonal changes and preservation techniques. Spring offered fresh greens, autumn brought root vegetables and stored legumes, fish preserved in salt provided occasional novelty. Monks learned to appreciate subtle differences in flavor and texture, reinforcing mindfulness and reflection. Every meal, though plain, contained layers of experience, skill, and observation. The psychological effects of such a disciplined diet were profound. Monotony reduced distraction and heightened focus. Meals became markers of time, reinforcing daily rhythm and structure. Hunger was rarely acute, but controlled, reminding monks of both mortality and discipline. Food, in its simplicity, became a tool for shaping mind and spirit as much as body. As you imagine monks slicing dense bread, chewing slowly on beans or dried vegetables, and attending to silent ritual readings while eating, it becomes clear that survival in the monastery depended as much on the careful, disciplined management of ordinary provisions as it did on prayer or work. The ordinary, monotonous diet was the foundation upon which spiritual endurance, labor, and reflection were built. As the day unfolded in a Cistercian monastery, the rhythm of meals and labor became inseparable from survival and spiritual focus. Monks rose before dawn, attending matins and lauds in dimly lit chapels. Physical labor followed, whether tending gardens, repairing buildings, or copying manuscripts. Each activity required energy, yet meals were neither frequent nor indulgent. The ordinary diet, bread, legumes, vegetables, and occasional cheese or fish, provided just enough nourishment to sustain long hours without distraction. Breakfast, if it occurred, was minimal, a small slice of bread, sometimes soaked in water or weak ale. This modest meal supplied enough energy to begin the day, but it was intentionally light to encourage alertness, not drowsiness. The act of eating was almost meditative. Monks chewed deliberately, reflecting on both sustenance and spiritual significance. The monotony of the meal reinforced discipline, conditioning the body and mind to focus on prayer and labor rather than appetite. Midday, the primary meal of the day, was simple yet sufficient. Hard bread served as a base, often accompanied by boiled beans, lentils, or cabbage. Occasionally, a wedge of hard cheese or a small portion of salted fish provided additional protein. Preparation was communal but silent, emphasizing efficiency, reflection, and cooperation. Monks learned to balance portions carefully. Too little risked fatigue, too much could disrupt focus or violate spiritual ideals of moderation. The diet was designed for sustained energy rather than pleasure. Bread provided slow-burning carbohydrates, legumes supplied protein and fiber, and vegetables contributed essential vitamins and hydration. Salted fish or cheese added concentrated nutrients. Together, these ordinary foods enabled endurance for labor and prayer, sustaining the body in a state of functional health while supporting spiritual practice. Preservation and storage were crucial. Bread was baked daily in communal ovens, but hard loaves could last several days if stored in cool, dry areas. Vegetables were preserved through drying, pickling, or root storage, ensuring year-round availability. Cheese was aged to resist spoilage, and fish was salted or smoked for long-term use. The success of monastic life depended not only on growing and cooking food, but also on maintaining its quality over time. Water and ale played a strategic role. Ale, weak but nutritious, provided calories and hydration when water was insufficient or contaminated. Drinking was synchronized with meals and labor schedules, ensuring consistent hydration without indulgence. Monks measured portions carefully, preventing overconsumption that could lead to fatigue or distraction. Even liquids were disciplined, part of the broader ethic of moderation. The integration of labor and diet was profound. Work was both physical and spiritual. Eating supported both. The energy from meals enabled planting, harvesting, building, or manuscript copying, while the simplicity of provisions reinforced spiritual focus. Even the act of preparing food, kneading bread, tending gardens, tending fires became a meditative practice, linking physical sustenance to contemplative life. Monotony, while seemingly dull, served a purpose. By repeating meals and maintaining consistent portions, monks developed a rhythm that aligned with prayer and labor cycles. Hunger was rarely extreme, but subtle enough to encourage mindfulness and humility. The plainness of food reminded monks that sustenance was functional, not indulgent, and reinforced values of obedience, self-discipline, and communal harmony. Community played a vital role in sustaining both diet and morale. Novices learned from elder monks how to ration provisions, prepare meals efficiently, and maintain spiritual focus despite hunger or fatigue. Group rituals around meal preparation and consumption reinforced cooperation, ensuring that the monastery operated smoothly. Disruptions such as spoilage, crop failure, or illness required collective problem-solving and adaptation, further strengthening communal bonds. Even small variations in diet were significant. Seasonal vegetables or a rare fresh fish became highlights, providing subtle changes that sustained morale without undermining discipline. Monks learned to savor these small differences mindfully, appreciating both nourishment and spiritual symbolism. Meals became a reflection of rhythm, scarcity, and moderation, linking daily sustenance to larger monastic ideals. By the end of the day, after hours of labor and prayer, monks returned to the evening meal, often lighter than the midday portion. Bread and vegetables were consumed with reflection, consolidating the lessons of endurance, moderation, and mindfulness learned throughout the day. The ordinary diet had sustained both physical labor and contemplative practice, reinforcing the harmony of body, mind, and spirit. As you imagine monks kneading dense bread, stirring lentil stews, and dividing portions among their community, it becomes clear that survival in a monastery depended not on abundance, but on careful, disciplined management of ordinary food. Each bite of bread, each sip of ale, each carefully rationed wedge of cheese contributed to labor, prayer, and reflection. In the quiet rhythm of daily meals, the Cistercians achieved endurance, focus, and communal cohesion, illustrating that even the simplest provisions can shape both lives and history. As the sun set over the monastery, the final meal of the day approached light, quiet, and deliberate. Supper was usually modest: a small loaf of bread, perhaps a portion of beans or cabbage, occasionally complemented by a wedge of aged cheese or a piece of salted fish. This meal was not intended for indulgence, but to provide sustenance after a day of labor and prayer while reinforcing the rhythm and discipline that defined monastic life. The impact of this austere diet was both physical and spiritual. Physically, it allowed monks to maintain long hours of manual work and continuous contemplation without overtaxing the body. The combination of carbohydrates from bread, protein from legumes and cheese, and hydration from water or weak ale ensured functional energy levels, even if the diet was monotonous. Fatigue was managed not through indulgent eating, but through rhythm, discipline, and careful portioning. Spiritually, the diet reinforced values central to monastic life. Monotony and simplicity reminded monks of humility, self-denial, and focus on higher purpose. Meals were often silent, accompanied by readings from scripture or reflections on moral and theological lessons. Eating became a meditative act, integrating body, mind, and spirit. The act of consuming plain, ordinary provisions was itself a lesson. Sustenance was functional, communal, and imbued with meaning beyond mere survival. The preparation of food continued to serve both practical and spiritual purposes. Baking bread, tending gardens, and preserving vegetables or fish were labor-intensive but also meditative, requiring attention, patience, and cooperation. These tasks reinforced community cohesion, teaching novices practical skills while embedding the principles of discipline and mindfulness into daily life. The act of transforming raw ingredients into nourishing meals became a ritual in itself, emphasizing the interdependence of labor and sustenance. Even in scarcity or monotony, subtle variation shaped experience. Seasonal vegetables, the occasional fresh fish, or the rare wedge of cheese offered minor relief from routine, fostering appreciation and gratitude. These small rewards were measured carefully. Overindulgence was avoided to preserve both physical health and spiritual focus. The discipline learned through routine enabled monks to find meaning and mindfulness in even the simplest provisions. Monastic diet and labor were mutually reinforcing. Work, whether in the fields, the workshops, or the scriptorium, required steady energy from carefully rationed provisions. Meals reinforced endurance for both physical labor and spiritual contemplation. The discipline of consumption, along with the monotony of meals, conditioned monks to embrace the rhythm of daily life, to balance effort and reflection, and to cultivate resilience in both body and mind. Historical evidence shows that this approach had long-term influence. Monastic practices influenced agricultural techniques, preservation methods, and the understanding of nutrition in medieval Europe. Bread making, legume cultivation, and vegetable storage methods developed within monasteries spread to surrounding communities. Monastic discipline around food influenced not only religious life, but also practical, everyday survival in towns and villages, demonstrating the broader impact of ordinary provisions. The lessons extended beyond nutrition. Shared meals, precise rationing, and communal preparation reinforced social cohesion. The Cistercian emphasis on moderation, mindfulness, and attention to detail shaped ethical and behavioral norms. Monks learned patience, observation, and the importance of steady, incremental effort principles equally applicable to spiritual practice and practical labor. Food, in its simplicity, became a medium through which discipline, endurance, and communal responsibility were cultivated. Monks' reflections on meals also illustrate the psychological dimension of simplicity. By limiting variation and encouraging mindfulness, the monotony of the diet fostered focus and resilience. Hunger was managed and anticipated rather than ignored, providing a constant reminder of dependence on both careful preparation and divine providence. Bread, legumes, and vegetables were tools for cultivating endurance, self-awareness, and moral discipline. By the end of the day, as monks returned to their cells for prayer and rest, the ordinary diet of bread, cheese, vegetables, and occasional fish had achieved more than mere nourishment. It had shaped rhythm, reinforced spiritual practice, sustained labor, and fostered community cohesion. These seemingly dull details, plain, repetitive meals consumed in silence, were fundamental to the success of monastic life. And so, as you imagine monks breaking dense bread in the dim light of the refectory, chewing slowly, reflecting on scripture, and tending to one another in quiet cooperation, you begin to see that ordinary provisions, monotonous, simple, and carefully managed, were the invisible backbone of history. The endurance, labor, and contemplation of the Cistercians depended not on abundance or luxury, but on the disciplined mastery of the most basic food. A loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a handful of beans. In this quiet, methodical sustenance lies a profound lesson. History often advances not through grand gestures, but through the steady, unglamorous management of ordinary life. And as the monks close their eyes in silent meditation, you may wonder, how much of human achievement, spiritual, practical, or intellectual, rests on the unremarkable, disciplined consumption of food that teaches endurance, focus, and resilience?